Hello and welcome to Let's Read Horror Stories. Please leave a comment where you are watching in the world. Please leave a like and subscribe. This really helps our channel grow. Thank you. Now relax and drift off to our True Crime Stories series. Story 1. The Disappearance of Susan Powell. Joshua Powell was born on January 20th, 1976, to Stephen and Terica Powell in Puyallup, Washington. He had two brothers, Michael and John, and two sisters, Jennifer and Alina. The Powell household was deeply dysfunctional due to Stephen's abusive behavior and his disaffection with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. According to divorce filings by Terica in 1992, Stephen shared pornography with his sons and refused to teach or enforce limits on certain behaviors. As a teenager, Joshua allegedly killed gerbils belonging to one of his sisters and threatened his mother with a butcher knife. He also attempted suicide on at least one occasion. By the late 1990s, Joshua was living in Tacoma as a student at the University of Washington. It was here that he began a relationship with a woman named Catherine Terry Everett, whom he met at a local LDS church congregation. After the two moved into an apartment together, Joshua exhibited possessive behavior towards Everett. She later recalled he refused to allow her to visit her family by herself and added, "He would have restrictions and limitations on what I could and couldn't do when it came to my family." When Everett visited a friend in Utah without Joshua, she decided not to return to Washington and broke up with him over the phone. Joshua met Susan Cox, a classmate at his LDS Church Institute of Religion course, during a dinner party at his Tacoma apartment in November 2000. The two began a relationship and married in the Portland, Oregon Temple in April 2001. Joshua obtained a bachelor's degree in business and worked for a number of different companies over the subsequent decade. Susan, a trained cosmetologist, took up a job with Wells Fargo Investments after the family relocated to West Valley City, Utah, a suburb of Salt Lake City. The Powells had two sons, Charles, born on January 19, 2005, and Braden, born on January 2, 2007. For a brief period following their wedding, Joshua and Susan lived with her father-in-law Stephen in South Hill, Washington. Stephen developed an obsessive infatuation with Susan and followed her around the house with a camcorder, used a small mirror to spy on her while she used the bathroom, stole underwear from her laundry, read her journals, and posted love songs online under a pseudonym. In 2003, Stephen confessed his amorous feelings to Susan, who rejected him. The encounter was inadvertently captured by Stephen's camcorder microphone. The Powells moved out of state soon after, partly so Susan could distance herself from Stephen. Susan's journal entries and email correspondence indicated the presence of marital discord. There was tension with Joshua over his refusal to attend church with his family, and over his continued contact with Stephen despite his father's ongoing advances toward Susan. Susan's friends also pointed to Joshua's extremely controlling behavior towards his wife and his extravagant spending habits. Joshua filed for bankruptcy in 2007, declaring over $200,000 in debts. Susan recorded a video in July 2008 surveying property damage she attributed to Joshua and wrote a secret will that included the statements, "I want it documented that there is extreme turmoil in our marriage, and, if I die, it may not be an accident, even if it looks like one."
On the morning of December 6, 2009, Susan, Charles, and Braden attended church. A neighbor visited them at home that afternoon, leaving at about 5 p.m. This was the last time Susan was seen by someone from outside the Powell household. At first, relatives reported the entire Powell family missing on December 7th. Joshua's mother, Terica, and his estranged sister, Jennifer Graves, went looking for them at their house shortly after being informed that the children had not been dropped off at daycare that morning. They called police after failing to make contact with Joshua or Susan. Police broke into the house, fearing the family were victims of carbon monoxide poisoning. They found no one inside, but noticed two box fans blowing at a wet spot on the couch. Susan did not show up at her job on December 7th. Her purse, wallet, and identification were all found inside the house. Her cell phone was later found in the family's only vehicle, a Chrysler Town and Country minivan that Joshua had been using. Later that day, at about 5 p.m., Joshua returned home with the two boys and was taken to the police station for questioning. He claimed he had left Susan sleeping at home shortly after midnight on December 7th and had taken his sons on a camping trip to the Pony Express Trail in western Utah. Police visited that area on December 10th, but found no evidence of the campsite that Joshua had described. They also found it suspicious that Joshua would take his young boys out camping in blizzard conditions after midnight when they were scheduled to go to daycare just hours later. Joshua had additionally not told his boss that he would not be coming into work that day and explained to police it was because he had thought it was Sunday rather than Monday. After a second round of police interrogation on the evening of December 8th, Joshua rented a car at Salt Lake City International Airport. His whereabouts after leaving the airport remain unknown. Around 18 hours later, at about 4 p.m. on December 9th, he called his mother from a new phone whilst on Interstate 84 in Tremonton driving south towards Salt Lake City. He would later tell Jennifer Graves that he had been driving laps around the city, getting on and off freeways at random. Police would later discover that Joshua had placed an additional 807 miles on the odometer of his rental car. Upon searching the Powell residence on December 9th, investigators found traces of Susan's blood on the floor, life insurance policies on Susan for $1.5 million, and a handwritten letter from Susan expressing fear for her life. DNA test results, released in 2013, matched one blood sample with Susan, while another sample was determined to have come from an unknown male contributor. In August 2012, West Valley City Police released documents showing Joshua took actions that were regarded as highly suspicious following Susan's disappearance. He liquidated his wife's retirement accounts, canceled her regularly scheduled chiropractic sessions, and withdrew his children from daycare. He had also previously spoken to coworkers about how to hide a body in an abandoned mine shaft in the western Utah desert. Police interviewed the Powell's elder son, Charlie, who confirmed that the camping trip Joshua described took place. However, unlike his father, he stated that Susan had gone with them and did not return. Weeks after her disappearance, a teacher reported Charlie had claimed that his mother was dead. Furthermore, Susan's parents, Chuck and Judy Cox, claimed that while at daycare several months after the disappearance, Braden drew a picture of a van with 3 people in it and told carers, "Mommy was in the trunk." Investigators informed the media that they planned to question Joshua again and subpoenaed all footage and interviews, aired and unaired, of Joshua from local television stations. On December 14th, Joshua retained an attorney in connection with the investigation, and police stated that he had grown increasingly uncooperative. A few days later, Joshua took his sons to Puyallup to stay with his father for the holidays. By December 24th, Joshua was considered a person of interest by investigators. On January 6, 2010, Joshua returned with his brother Michael to pack the family's belongings, indicating he was moving permanently to Puyallup.
In Puyallup, Joshua occupied a home with his 2 sons, his father Stephen, his brothers Michael and Jonathan, and his sister Alina. Joshua indicated that he would rent out his house in Utah. It was reported that he returned to Puyallup after he had lost his job in West Valley City. Soon afterwards, the website SusanPowell.org was launched. Described as the official website of Susan Powell, the site's anonymous entries defended Joshua as the victim of a smear campaign by Susan's family, his estranged sister Jennifer, and the LDS Church. Additional posts also speculated that Susan's disappearance was connected to that of Stephen Kocher, a former journalist who had vanished in Nevada the same week as Susan, and that the two had run off to Brazil together. Joshua and Stephen were widely believed to have written these posts. In late 2010, both men claimed that Susan had abandoned her family due to mental illness and that she had left with another man. Susan's family rejected these claims as being unsupported by any evidence. Investigators' scrutiny extended to Stephen upon learning from a family friend that he had been obsessed with his son's wife. Computer images seized from his house in 2010 turned up 4,500 images of Susan taken without her knowledge, including close-ups of specific body parts. Police also turned their attention to Michael after learning that he had sold his broken-down Ford Taurus to a wrecking yard in Pendleton, Oregon, shortly after Susan's disappearance, and had later ordered satellite images of the lot. When police found the car, a cadaver dog indicated that decomposing human remains had been in the trunk. DNA tests on the car proved inconclusive. On September 14, 2011, Utah authorities discovered a possible gravesite while searching Topaz Mountain, a desert area near Nephi, that Joshua had visited often as a campsite. There were signs of recent soil disturbance and shoveling, but after digging a few feet down, police were unable to find any remains in spite of careful sifting of the soil. Federal anthropologists also ruled out the possibility of the site being an ancient burial ground. Police continued to examine the site for a time, but offered no explanation as to why they previously announced the finding of remains when none had actually been confirmed. Authorities said they were following a scent detected by their sniffer dogs. Relations between and within the Powell and Cox families became increasingly hostile. After the police raided their home in 2011, both Joshua and Stephen spoke to major news outlets regarding journals that Susan had allegedly written about the relationship between Stephen and herself. Stephen claimed that he and Susan had been falling in love prior to her disappearance, and he cited the content of the journals, written when Susan was a teenager, as evidence to support his theory that she was mentally unstable and could have run away with another man. A judge issued a permanent injunction forbidding Joshua and Stephen from publishing any material from Susan's journals, ordering the pair to either return or destroy any journals already published. On September 22nd, Stephen was arrested on charges of voyeurism and child pornography after police found evidence that he had secretly videotaped young girls and numerous women, including Susan. John Long, Assistant Attorney General for Washington State, said that Joshua was a subject in this investigation. A friend of Stephen claimed that he was preoccupied with pornography and was hung up on Susan sexually. Chuck Cox, Susan's father, filed for custody of her children the day after Stephen was arrested. A Washington court eventually granted Cox temporary custody of the boys, ruling that Joshua would have to move out of Stephen's residence if he wanted to regain custody. Joshua rented a house in South Hill, but authorities later alleged that he had never actually moved into there, merely making it appear as if he had satisfied the court's instructions while continuing to reside at Stephen's residence. In late September 2011, Jennifer Graves stated her belief that her brother Joshua was responsible for his wife Susan Powell's disappearance. His other sister, Alina, had been suspicious of him as well. However, she later withdrew her suspicions and felt that Joshua had been unduly harassed by investigators. By this time, West Valley City had spent more than $500,000 on the case. On September 28th, Mayor Mike Winder indicated that he felt that the case was worth the expense, stating, "We feel that we are getting to that tipping point where we have more hot evidence than we have had in the past 2 years, and that the case was moving forward." In late 2011, Joshua underwent a series of court-ordered evaluations in Washington. The evaluations, conducted by James Manley, determined that he had adequate parenting skills, a steady employment history, and no criminal record or history of domestic violence. However, Manley also raised issues concerning the ongoing criminal investigations, Joshua's failure to admit normal personal shortcomings, his overbearing behavior with his sons, and his persistent defensiveness and paranoia, attributed to the police and media attention in conjunction with underlying narcissistic traits. His initial recommendation was for Joshua to have visitation with his sons several times a week, supervised by a social worker. In the last week of January 2012, West Valley City Police discovered about 400 images of simulated child pornography, bestiality, and incest on a computer seized from the Powell residence. The pornography had been cached when viewed by the previous owner of the computer, which had been purchased by Susan secondhand. Utah authorities accused Joshua of having viewed the images. The images, while not illegal due to them being in a hand-drawn or cartoonish 3D format, were cause for great concern to Manley, particularly given his earlier denial of possessing any such material. Joshua was recommended to receive a more thorough psychosexual evaluation and polygraph test, but Manley suggested no change in the visitation schedule with the Powell children. Meanwhile, Joshua's brother Michael established a Google Sites page that claimed Susan's parents were abusing and neglecting the children in collusion with child welfare authorities. He also alleged that West Valley City Police had both mishandled the investigation into Susan's disappearance and were harassing Joshua. Lawyers for the Cox family disputed the allegations, and Google removed the site after a few days due to violations of its terms of use. Story 2. The House on West Clay Street. Tabitha Pope's story begins in late August 2021, when she heard of an apartment available in a 3-story house just outside downtown Houston. Pope, then 32, desperately needed a place to live. For the better part of 9 months, she'd been staying at the Great Value Inn, a $35 a night motel on the city's west side, with her boyfriend, Will, then 47. Pope had never made much money. She'd worked retail and service industry jobs in the area since finishing high school. At Kohl's for a few years, IHOP for a couple after that. But she'd always been able to afford low-rent places in the suburbs. In 2016, she was priced out of an apartment for the first time in the town of Katy. In 2019, the year after she met Will, the two missed a payment for their place in Rosenberg and were kicked out. They moved in with a friend, a waiter at IHOP, who'd stayed with Pope in the past when he himself was hard up. After about a month, the friend stole and sold Pope's car, a 2007 Toyota Corolla she'd saved for years to buy. When she contacted the police, they instructed her to file a demand letter, allowing 10 days for the vehicle's return. But by the time she did, the car was at the scrap yard being torn apart. Without it, Pope lost her job. She'd most recently been working as a delivery driver, and she and Will started staying in motels. Life at the Great Value Inn was particularly grim. Their room was cramped, and the neighborhood, Gulfton, was rough. Between January 2021 and April 2022, the police logged an average of 14 crimes there a day. Other guests partied all night. Pope heard of someone being shot in the parking lot and taken away in an ambulance that July. The couple spent their days working construction. Will had contacts on a few local crews, and Pope was able to join when jobs required extra hands. They patched drywall, demolished old kitchens, tore up carpet, and laid flooring for $15 an hour. Though prices for a two-bedroom apartment in Houston had gone up by 29% between 2015 and 2021, they could theoretically pay a cut-rate rent. But they couldn't manage to save enough for a security deposit. It was an acquaintance who told Pope about the available apartment and connected her to a man named Michael Brown, who, over the phone, offered to show her the house. It was on West Clay Street, at the intersection of the 4th Ward and Montrose neighborhoods, an area that had gradually gentrified over the past 20 years and was considered fairly safe. The home had a haphazard facade of gray and beige brick on the first and second levels and tan vinyl siding above. Two tall, anemic palm trees and a reaching live oak stood within the narrow, gated front yard, and there were porches on the first and second floors. The backyard, patched with dead grass, was scattered with trash, and a broken hot tub sat uninstalled and uncovered on a stone patio. Brown's girlfriend, a woman named Pamela Merritt, then 41, greeted Pope and Will warmly when they arrived, hugging them both. Merritt was around 5'11", a good 5 inches taller than Pope, but the two otherwise looked remarkably similar. Both had naturally brunette hair that had been dyed purple, Merritt's with additional stripes of pink, and both were dressed in ripped jeans, tank tops, and black combat boots. Pope's were Doc Martens. She'd found them in a dumpster. Brown, who appeared to be in his 40s as well, joined them, and the four gathered in the couple's living room, a cluttered space, a little upturned, as Pope described it. Merritt said they'd recently had a break-in. The house overall, she added, was in a bit of rough shape, but if Pope and Will were willing to spruce it up, clean out the second and third floors, maybe paint some walls, she would give them a discount on rent, from $750 a month down to $600. Best of all, there would be no security deposit. There were 4 apartments in the house, she explained. 2 one-bedrooms downstairs, Merritt and Brown's in the front and another in the back. A 2-bedroom on the second floor and a loft on the third. The unit for rent was Merritt and Brown's, and it would come furnished. They'd be leaving for a few weeks, and they planned to move into the second floor when they returned. The idea was that Pope would ready the space for them while they were away. None of the other apartments were currently occupied. Merritt said they were hoping to eventually set the place up as a bed and breakfast. When all was agreed to, Brown still had some things to do before they could head out, and Merritt offered to pass the time by styling Pope's hair. She was taking a cosmetology class, she said, and needed a model for an assignment. If Pope was up for it, she'd install a partial weave and take a photo for her instructor. The suggestion was strange and the familiarity surprising, but Pope was happy to oblige. It seemed like Merritt wanted to bond. Merritt was a bit rough with her hair as she was braiding, but Pope didn't say anything. She was set on getting the apartment. There was one moment that evening, however, that in retrospect Pope would see as a warning sign. As Merritt worked away, sewing a blonde weft under the top layers of Pope's hair, Pope asked Brown an innocuous question, to hand her something nearby. According to Pope, Merritt became suddenly furious. She accused Pope of secretly knowing Brown and of sleeping with him. The two had never once met, and Pope was alarmed, but tried to stay calm. It seemed Merritt couldn't be reasoned with, so Pope let her rant and exhaust herself for a few moments before gently interjecting that she was mistaken. Merritt regained her composure, and Pope suggested they take a walk. It was sweltering outside, but the two women circled nearby streets for half an hour. Pope told Merritt that she didn't need to worry, that she was a good person. Merritt, relaxed and almost serene now, apologized. Some girls couldn't be trusted, she said. The next morning, Merritt and Brown returned to the house briefly. Merritt said they'd be coming back periodically while they were away to get their mail and check on Pope's progress with the cleaning. She didn't say where they were going, though Pope guessed it couldn't be far. Offhand, Merritt added that she technically didn't own the house. The landlord was a man named Colin. He'd lived on the third floor, but he'd up and left a couple months before without explanation. Before taking off, Merritt brought Pope upstairs to show her the work needed on the second floor. When she started to open the door, however, an intense, rotten stench flooded the hallway, and she seemed to change her mind. She told Pope not to worry about the smell. A refrigerator had stopped working, spoiling some meat, she explained, and the odor had lingered. She closed the door, and the two returned downstairs. It was a couple weeks before Pope got a look at that apartment. She and Will spent their first days as renters away on a renovation job in Waco. When they got back, the crew Will would be joining didn't have enough work for her to go along, so she decided to get started on the house. She laced up her work boots, grabbed some contractor's bags she'd nabbed from a construction site, and headed up to the second floor. The apartment was in a state of chaos. Trash, clothes, and household items covered the floor, backpacks, old radios, dirty coffee pots. She wasn't totally surprised. Merritt and Brown clearly lived at the margins, and mess was a part of the deal. But the odor was much worse than she'd remembered. It just smelled like death, she said. She opened all the windows and got to work bagging things up. The stench did not seem to dissipate. After an hour or so, she headed into the kitchen to take a look at whatever it was that remained in the fridge. There on the tile floor, in the center of the room, were two large plastic storage bins, the kind one might use to store winter coats. And at the bottom of each was a few inches of rusty red liquid. It looked very much like blood, and it reeked. Next to the containers was a reddish-brown crust, an outline of a rectangle of the same size, as if there'd been a third bin that had been moved. Aside this was a pool, 5 or 6 feet long and almost as wide, of what appeared to be the same fetid liquid congealed. What the fuck, Pope thought. Carefully, she dragged the bins out to the second-floor porch, their noxious contents sloshing. Then she kept cleaning. It seemed like the thing to do. Soon, she thought, she would understand the connection between the story of the spoiled meat and the liquid. There was some reasonable way it came together. But none came to her. She was mopping at the viscid substance on the kitchen floor when she remembered the mention of Colin, the man who Merritt said owned the house. Were the things in this apartment his? Why would he leave without taking them? What the fuck, she thought again. Did I just fuck everything up? When Will got home from work that night, Pope showed him the bins. He was immediately dismissive. Whatever that was, and it was really unclear what it was, he said, it was not their place to get involved. They couldn't risk losing the apartment. Merritt stopped by the house the following week. It was now late September. Pope believed by then that Merritt and Brown were staying in nearby hotels. It was a way to bring in rent money before the house was ready. She decided to probe, cautiously, for information about Colin. Y'all just don't know what happened to him, she asked. Have you heard anything? Merritt, in a matter-of-fact tone, began her reply with an admission. Colin hadn't abandoned the house. He was actually dead. Pope's heart jumped. Merritt continued. He'd had some sort of infected wound on his abdomen from falling on a spike, and she and Brown had eventually taken him to the hospital, where he died. Pope could barely understand what she was saying. The idea of falling on a spike was absurd. What kind of spike? Where? But she didn't ask any more questions that day, and she didn't pack up her things. She and Will had already handed over rent for the next month, and they didn't have money for another place. Even if they'd wanted to go back to the motel, it would have required a deposit they couldn't have paid. In my bank account, Pope said, I had literally nothing. A few dollars. She didn't believe Merritt's story about Colin and the spike. She couldn't, but she didn't know what to believe instead. It seemed unreal that Merritt or Brown could have murdered a person, never mind gathering his blood in storage bins. But there seemed to be no question something terrible had happened to Colin, and Pope felt some strange kinship with the missing man, a faint pulling connection. I don't know if people believe in the supernatural, she said, but there was something compelling me to stay. Pope's choice to stay at the house beyond her initial discovery of what appeared to be buckets of blood stretches the imagination. Never mind Merritt changing her story about Kradachi completely and the ludicrous explanation of the spike, which sounded concocted by a child. It was wildly dangerous to continue living in such a place in more sense than one. If Pope herself was not in peril, and there was no reason to believe she wasn't, the house seemed to be, at the very least, the scene of some horrific crime. She was tampering with evidence. She was risking her own future. Throughout our conversations, Pope insisted that it took some time to really comprehend her situation, and that, when she began to accept just how bad it was, she felt she had no choice but to stay. For a period, I assumed this meant that neither she nor Will had anyone to turn to for help. No family, no friends, no kind acquaintances. That the choice was between sleeping in a house where someone had likely been murdered and sleeping on the street. Pope and Will, after all, didn't even have a car. But I eventually learned that Pope's parents were each relatively nearby. She had a strained relationship with her father but spoke to him occasionally, and he was 2.5 hours from Houston, in Austin, with his wife. Her mother was an hour away, in a town northwest of Katy. Her mother had told her many times that she was always welcome to come back home. Pope said she stayed at the house on West Clay Street instead of going to her mother's, because she was determined to make it on her own. She added that her mother had moved into an RV and space would have been very tight. Pope also felt, she said repeatedly, a deep need to discover the truth. She had always tried to be a good person, and it hadn't yet worked out for her, but she couldn't let go of Colin Kradachi. He had a family and friends. He was a human being. She had to do something to help. There was something else, too. Will had been using heroin on and off for more than a decade, since his 20s, when he'd been prescribed an opiate painkiller following an injury. He'd hurt his back working on railroads, laying iron track by hand. He'd gotten clean for a short time before he and Pope met, but started up again within the first year of their relationship, and his addiction had affected many of their choices. He held the couple's money. The foreman at the construction job gave Will both their paychecks, and according to Pope, he spent much of it on drugs. It was clear that she could not have gone home to her mother's and continued to live with Will. I couldn't bring his problems home with me like that, she said. He was good to her in many ways, and she didn't want to give up on him. He sang to her, ran her bath, made dinner. When there was money, it was steak and potatoes. When there wasn't, she said, he would make something out of nothing for me. Pope was also very aware that Will didn't have anyone else. She didn't know what would happen to him if they broke up. She told me, it's always been easier for me to help other people than to do the things I need to do for myself. Merritt and Brown returned to the house in early November and moved into the second-floor unit. Pope's mind was constantly cycling through thoughts of the blood on the third-floor walls and hidden in the dark of the crawlspace and of Kradachi's family, out there somewhere, whom she imagined trying and failing to reach him. Merritt had seemed erratic in her early interactions with Pope, but after she and Brown returned to the house, she seemed deeply unstable. According to Pope, Merritt superglued the gearshift in Brown's car, an old Audi sedan, following a shouting argument. Soon after, she introduced Pope to a neighbor passing by as my daughter, and then continued talking to Pope as if nothing had happened. Pope could often hear her screaming at Brown. Pope would sometimes find him outside after a tumultuous night, in the backyard or on the downstairs porch, where he and Merritt both liked to sit at the edge, their legs hanging over the concrete. He called the outbursts episodes, but seemed to write them off as insignificant. Brown was unable to be reached for this story. In late November, when the Omicron variant of COVID-19 began to spread, work on the construction crew slowed, and Pope was once again in the house on most days. Brown had an occasional gig on a crew of his own, but Merritt was usually at home, and the two women began spending portions of their days together, sitting outside and chatting. Pope started free-arranging conversations and let Merritt talk, hoping enough real information would slip out that she could develop a picture of what had happened to Kradachi. Merritt told her she was from Midland, Texas, and that she'd been married for some years. Her husband had died in a motorcycle accident, she said. She'd seen the crash. She and Brown had gotten together in 2019 in Dallas. She approached him in his car at a gas station and called him a handsome devil, and that was basically that. They'd moved into the house on West Clay about a year before Pope arrived. It was unclear if she had aspirations beyond getting by. She never mentioned cosmetology school again after that first meeting. At one point, she got a job at a bar, which seemed to last a month or so. In December, Merritt told Pope, rather casually, that the house had gone into foreclosure. She hadn't been paying the mortgage. Pope was only a little taken aback, and she saw an opportunity. The next day, as coolly as she could, she broached the subject again. "You know, if Colin's body were to show up somewhere," she said, "it wouldn't be a foreclosure because he wouldn't have knowingly or intentionally not paid the mortgage." She knew this wasn't true. She'd looked it up the night before, but it sounded right enough. If Cardaci was dead, she told Merritt, the house would go into the much slower process of court-supervised probate. It would buy them some time. 2 days later, Pope caught a ride to the grocery store with Merritt and Brown. She didn't exactly feel safe in the car with them, but she didn't have her own vehicle, and she needed food. Merritt and Brown sat in the front, whispering. Pope, in the back, strained to hear them. They were saying something about a dead dog back at the house, under a staircase. Pope stayed quiet. The next day, in the late morning, she joined Merritt on the porch and asked directly about what she'd heard. What was this about a dead dog? According to Pope, Merritt didn't seem at all surprised. She looked up, the light of a dare flickering in her eyes, and asked if Pope wanted to see it. Merritt stood and led Pope down off the porch and around the house, toward a set of external stairs that connected the second-floor apartment and the backyard's stone patio. When she reached the staircase, she stopped and looked at Pope. There it was, she said. She pointed to a dark patch of ground under the lowest landing, enclosed by chicken wire. Almost as soon as she spoke, she turned and began walking back toward the front of the house. Pope watched her leave, and then looked into the shadow under the stairs. In her weeks of cleaning, she'd already attended to this spot, pulling out litter that had accumulated despite the chicken wire. But now somehow there it was, a human body. First she saw a torso on its side. It was decomposing, vertebrae exposed in places where the flesh had fully rotted away. Covering the head was a piece of rumpled clothing. Pope remembers it as a blue sweater. It was dirty and inside out, as if it had overturned as the body was dragged. Pope took a series of pictures with her phone, her hands shaking, and hurried back around the house and into her apartment. She locked the door and sat against it holding her phone. She tried to second-guess what she'd seen. She'd found the blood, the knife, and all the rest months ago. But in the intervening time, she'd come to see Merritt and Brown as sympathetic people. If not normal, they were certainly human. They took little drives around the neighborhood together. Merritt stayed up waiting for Brown to get home with food ready for him. When she cooked, usually pasta dishes, she would make extra to feed the neighborhood raccoons. She was deeply troubled, there was no question about it, but she wasn't evil. Pope reached for alternative theories. Maybe it really could be a dog under the stairs, maybe she was seeing things, or maybe she'd gotten the entire story wrong. Perhaps Cardaci himself was the murderer. He could have killed someone and fled. Merritt, whose mind was certainly clouded, might have really believed the body was a dog. But Pope's thoughts were like water circling the black hole of a drain. She felt sure Merritt and Brown were somehow responsible. She texted photos of the body to 2 friends. The answer came back immediately. Call the fucking cops. Over the next 4 or 5 hours, Pope considered her options. She assumed things would go differently with the police now. There had definitively been a murder. But if they showed up and somehow dragged their feet again, she would be in an extremely dangerous position. She came up with an out. She would call animal control and tell them she needed help with a dead dog. Its officers would arrive and discover a human body, and they would be the ones to call the police. But when she reached the agency, she was told it didn't deal with remains on private property. Next, she decided she would try to get Brown to give her the okay to call the cops. He seemed to be under Merritt's thrall, in love with her and temperamentally overpowered, but he was more in tune with reality, and Pope knew she could reach him. She brought him to the staircase and pointed, as Merritt had. "You can't tell me that's not a human," she said. Brown did not seem alarmed. He shrugged and put up his hands. He didn't know what to say. It was a dog. Pope took a breath. Was it perhaps possible, she asked, that Merritt could have killed Cardaci while she was having one of her episodes? Again, Brown did not seem startled or even distressed. His answer was hesitant but not defensive. He said she wouldn't hurt a fly, that she wasn't violent at all. Pope responded gently that she understood. "But on the off chance it's a human," she said, "we'll get in trouble if we don't report it." They had to call the cops. Brown paused a moment, then agreed. He asked Pope to give them some time to get their stuff and leave. The 2 went back to their respective apartments. Pope sat alone for hours, waiting to hear Brown and Merritt leave. Around 7 p.m., Will got home from work, and she brought him to the backyard to see the body. His face went white. There was no denying it this time. With Will in the house, Pope felt safe enough to go check on Merritt and Brown. She knocked and opened their door. They were in the entryway, holding rollers and cans of white paint. They were painting over blood that Pope had never noticed, on the interior side of the door and on the surrounding walls. Standing in the hallway, she attempted to feign disinterest. "Are y'all ready to go yet?" she asked. "I want to call." Brown said they would need another 30 minutes. Pope went back downstairs, locked the door. After a few hours, at around midnight, Merritt and Brown were still in the house, and Pope decided to report the body to the police in person. The downtown station was a 30-minute walk, but she couldn't risk them hearing her on the phone. Will stayed behind. When Pope arrived at the station, the desk officer told her he couldn't help. These types of reports had to be made over the phone. She showed him the photographs of the body, but he waved her away, saying again that she had to call it in. It was now nearly 1 a.m. Pope walked back to the house crying. Whatever well of composure she'd accessed was running out. When she got back, the Audi was still in the driveway. Will had gone to bed, so she joined him, but she slept only a few minutes at a time. In the morning, the car was still there. Pope couldn't wait any longer. She dialed the non-emergency number the desk officer had given her the night before. Busy. She tried again, and was placed on hold before she had a chance to say why she was calling. She waited on the line an hour before hanging up and trying again. Another hold. Around noon, she saw a patrol car drive by. She quietly stepped outside, and when she knew she was no longer in view of the house, began to run. She caught the cruiser at a corner store a few blocks down. An officer in the driver's seat rolled down his window. "I think there's a dead body in my backyard," Pope said. He scanned her up and down, looking annoyed. "You need to call it in." Pope was starting to crack. She was crying on and off, and her heart was racing. When she got back to the house, Merritt and Brown were sitting on the front porch. She tried to act casual and asked what they had planned for the day, though that didn't make sense. One of them must have answered, but she wasn't listening. After a few minutes, Merritt stood and went inside, and Pope kneeled down next to Brown. "I'm going to call the police," she said. "Right now." Merritt and Brown left in just under an hour. They didn't seem to pack any bags or take much with them. In the early evening, Pope called 911 and was finally allowed to report the dead body. She paced the apartment while she waited for the police to arrive, turned over the details of everything that had happened. She was primed for the cops to doubt her. At around 9 p.m., she heard Merritt and Brown return. 2 hours later, the cops finally showed up. Pope led them to the body and handed over the SD card. Merritt and Brown were taken down to the station. In the early morning hours, the medical examiner arrived and collected the body, and Pope was put into the back of a cruiser, where she stayed for nearly 4 hours. At the station, according to police records, Merritt repeatedly insisted that the body was a dog and told detectives that Kurdachi had faked his death to commit fraud and is probably alive in Africa. Pope would learn later that Kurdachi was from South Africa. In the early morning, Merritt and Brown arrived back at the house. The police had opened a murder investigation, but neither had been charged with any crime. For the next few days, Pope hid out in her apartment. She barricaded her door, pushing a heavy dresser across the jamb, and plotted an emergency escape route through a window. When her toilet stopped working, she was forced to venture upstairs to the 3rd floor and saw Merritt and Brown in the hallway for the first time. They didn't speak, but she took some comfort in how they averted their eyes. She came to believe they were not an imminent threat. A month after the body was taken away, Pope asked Will to leave the house. Throughout the ordeal, she'd felt alone, abandoned even when he was present, and there was no sign of him getting clean. She knew she could never achieve a stable life if they stayed together. Pope now had $20 in her bank account, and without her connection to Will and the construction crew, she had very little money coming in. Through a friend, she was able to snag a few hours of handy work at a local apartment complex, but she was most often at home. During the days, the 3 remaining housemates avoided one another. Merritt never confronted Pope about calling the police. But at night, she said, Merritt began to bang on her door and shout, usually incoherently. Sometimes she screamed that Pope was having sex with Brown. On one occasion, she yelled that Pope had done something terrible to her son. Whether Merritt really had a son, Pope didn't know. Then, in January, a man named Nathan Kurdachi and his wife, Angela, arrived at the house carrying concealed 9mm handguns. Pope answered the door. Nathan was Colin's estranged son. He'd been contacted by relatives in South Africa, who'd seen the news of an unidentified body discovered at the residence. They hadn't heard from Colin in months, and they'd asked Nathan to find out what he could. Merritt and Brown were home, so Pope suggested they take a walk, and she recounted all that had happened. Nathan told me later that she seemed very genuinely concerned about his father's fate. She was trying to do the right thing, he said. Before he and Angela left, Pope gave them a box of Colin's personal items and the bound family album. Nathan tried to encourage her to leave. "You need to get yourself out of this situation," he said. "You need to be careful. If they've done it once, what's going to stop them from doing something like that again?" But Pope would stay in the house for another year and a half. That February, she moved to the third floor. She threw out the bloody mattress and finished painting the walls. The police had told her she could do what she wanted. It was no longer an active crime scene. She continued to barricade her door every night, though there were no new incidents with Merritt or Brown. She saw them both rarely now. It seemed they had all learned to time exits and entrances to avoid one another. When they did cross paths, they said hello. Polite, tight-lipped neighbors. In March, the power in the house was cut off. It seemed Merritt hadn't been paying the utilities, and within a week, Merritt and Brown were gone. Pope still didn't have any money. Getting another place was impossible, and she still preferred the house to moving in with her mother or crashing with a friend. She prayed she'd be able to stay as long as it took to build up a small savings. But each day was a struggle. She used flashlights at night and in the hallways. She charged her phone most days in a parking garage, sometimes in a pizza parlor, and she cooked over a fire in the backyard. Every few weeks, she called the Houston Police Department and asked for updates on the murder investigation. They told her always that they were working on it and to stop calling. In July, the body found under the staircase was finally identified through the use of dental records as Colin Cardaci. Nathan informed Pope. According to the Harris County Forensics Department, Cardaci's death was a homicide caused by sharp force and blunt force trauma to the head, neck, and torso. Still, no one was charged with his murder. 8 months later, in March 2023, a sergeant named Ross Watson, the new lead investigator, arrived unannounced at the house and asked to see the storage been sealed into the third-floor crawlspace. It had never been sampled. That May, Merritt was charged with Cardaci's murder, but it took until August for police to find her. Brown was not charged with a crime. The state alleged that Merritt had stabbed Cardaci to death on February 15, 2021, during the deep freeze. Watson had learned that a previous tenant, unknown to Pope, had called the police on February 23rd, saying that Merritt had admitted to the murder that day. The police, as they would again later, briefly detained Merritt and then released her without any charges. The tenant moved out immediately, and that summer, Pope took his place. Merritt was arraigned in late August 2023. As of early January, no trial date has been set. Merritt's lawyer did not comment for this story. When I spoke to Harris County Assistant District Attorney Andrew Figliuzzi this fall, he emphasized Pope's role in the case. "Without Tabitha," he said, "we may not even be here." As for Pope, she finally left the house on West Clay Street in September 2023, 3 weeks after Merritt was arrested, 2 years after she first found Cardaci's blood. She was still flat broke, but she had a plan to stay with an elderly woman in Missouri City, a half-hour southwest of Houston, in exchange for helping her around the house. After a few months, that arrangement collapsed. The woman accused Pope of slacking and damaging her property, and Pope went to stay with friends, back in Houston, sleeping in a van on their property. Soon after her arrival, their house burned down in an electrical fire. But Pope stayed. Last we spoke, she was collecting wooden shipping pallets. She planned to use them to build a tiny house. When she had enough money, she said she was going to buy a trailer, build the home, and drive it away. She didn't know where she'd go. Story 3. Dominique Pellicot, the sexual predator. Dominique Pellicot called himself a family man. He liked cycling in the French countryside on a Sunday. He took his son and grandson to football matches, and he was good at celebrating birthdays. "My parents had this talent for organizing surprise birthday parties for us," his eldest son, David, has said. "All our friends would be there, and my friends would say how lucky I was to have a dad like that. Everyone adored him at those parties. My friends saw him as a role model. He danced with my friends, he sat down to eat with my friends, and today those friends don't understand what's going on." Dominique, a 72-year-old retired electrician and estate agent, is now described by his family as the worst sexual predator in recent French history. Over a 9-year period from 2011 to 2020, He crushed sleeping tablets and anti-anxiety medication into his unsuspecting wife's mashed potato, ice cream, coffee or beer, and invited dozens of men he met online to come to the couple's house in a village in Provence to rape her while she was unconscious. He also hid cameras to secretly photograph and film his son's wives in their own bathrooms or rooms in his home, including when one was pregnant with twins, and shared naked photographs of them online. He photographed his adult daughter asleep semi-naked, in underwear she didn't recognize as her own, sparking her own fears that she too had been drugged and abused, though he denied in court ever abusing her. He repeatedly raped another man's wife after teaching him how to use the same drugging technique. He had proposed teaching several other men how to drug their own girlfriends or wives, and even one man's mother, suggesting he could rape them too. Giselle Pellicott, 72, has become a feminist hero for insisting that the rape trial of her now ex-husband Dominique and 50 other accused men should be held in public, so that shame could change sides. The story of all these men and their alleged sex crimes must be told, she said, in order to end what she called rape culture, where sexual violence is so commonplace in society it is almost shrugged off, and because Pellicott and the men got away with it for so long. On Saturday, September 12, 2020, Dominique, a father of 3 and grandfather of 6 described by friends as a jovial guy, left his house with a nice garden and small pool in the picturesque village of Mazan in Provence, and drove 20 minutes to the large supermarket in the town of Carpentras. He and Giselle, his wife of 50 years and a former logistics manager in an electricity firm, had retired to this village, filled with stone houses with pastel blue shutters, in 2013. Giselle liked country walks and singing in a choir. She was away that weekend, taking care of her grandchildren in Paris. It was a hot day, and lots of women at the supermarket were wearing summer dresses and sandals. Dominique, dressed in a polo shirt and shorts, carried a black bag with a hidden camera in it. He loitered closely behind 4 women, holding the bag low to the ground and pointing it up their skirts. He photographed and recorded as one woman reached for an item from the dairy fridge, another as she looked at baby clothes in the children's section. Until 2 years earlier, upskirting in France had not been specifically addressed by its own legislation. Some women who filed complaints said they were asked by police, "Why were you wearing a skirt?" But clearer laws and tougher penalties had been introduced in 2018. The outraged supermarket security guard who spotted Dominique filming immediately called the police and urged the women to file complaints. One woman, who at first had not noticed Pellicott filming up her skirt, wasn't sure who to believe: the furious security guard making a big fuss, or the seemingly nice man with puppy eyes who looked like a poor innocent, she later said in a French TV interview. But she and the other women did report the offense. The small team of police in Carpentras Station were overworked that day on a pile-up of cases, including domestic violence and assault incidents. But when this white-haired pensioner told them he filmed up women's skirts at the supermarket because his wife was away and he'd had an urge, they had a hunch to look closer at the chat history of the 2 phones he was carrying, which they confiscated. Then they searched his home. They would find thousands of photos and videos of rape and abuse on Dominique's phones, computer and hard drive, leading to the biggest rape trial in French history, which is due to conclude on December 20th. Dominique had messaged men on the unmoderated chat site Coco, which has since been shut down, offering them his wife while drugged. His conversations, which continued by phone or instant messaging, included lines such as, "I'm looking for a pervert accomplice to abuse my wife who's been put to sleep," or "You're like me, you like rape mode." He spent time in a chat room on the site called Against Her Knowledge, where he shared photos of his unconscious wife. In a folder called Abuse on his hard drive, he had meticulously archived videos of more than 200 rapes of Giselle by strangers where she was in a coma-like state, akin to being anesthetized. Most took place in the couple's bedroom, with the bedside lamps switched on, spotty pillowcases and burgundy wallpaper, family photos in a frame on the chest of drawers beside a jar of fragrance sticks, and the sound of the television on in the background. When the men arrived, Giselle was seen limp and inert in the recovery position on the bed, snoring loudly, undressed or wearing underwear Dominique had bought and dressed her in. Dominique would tell the men to help themselves. He would make degrading and obscene comments about the slut off camera while filming. He propped notes beside her that read, "Service slut and whore," or wrote on her body, "I'm a submissive slut." Some men did thumbs up or victory signs to the camera. Dominique told the court that he would get medication on prescription from his doctor, and hide it in a sock in a hiking shoe in his garage. He would add it to his wife's food or drink, usually at night, and had perfected a dose that would leave her unconscious for about 7 hours. Enough time for him and another man, or several consecutive men, to rape her, after which he would wash her and put her pajamas back on. His rules stated that the men should park nearby and walk to the house to avoid waking the neighbors, and they must take their clothes off in the kitchen. Most kept their socks on. One fire officer kept the top half of his uniform on with the name of the local fire service, which helped the police identify him. The men then had to warm their hands on the radiator, not smoke, drink alcohol, or wear aftershave, whisper while in the bedroom, and wash their hands and have short nails because he couldn't stand the idea of dirty fingernails on his wife. Condoms were not required, indeed sometimes discouraged. Giselle now lives with the lifelong consequences of 4 sexually transmitted diseases. In court, some of the men said they hadn't respected any rules on smoking or drinking. Some had smoked countless joints before arriving. One had drunk a bottle of whiskey. This went on for 9 years, with an increase in visits during the year of COVID lockdowns. One of the men, Jerome V., a grocery worker, went 6 times during lockdown. In court, he admitted to rape, saying he was attracted to the idea of being able to have complete freedom of action over an inert body. A total of 50 men aged 26 to 74, including a nurse, a journalist, a soldier, a computer expert, farm workers, lorry drivers and shop workers, appeared in the 4-month trial with Dominique and are awaiting their verdicts, which are due next week. If convicted, they face prison sentences of between 4 and 20 years. Most of the men deny rape, saying they thought it was a consensual game orchestrated by a couple of swingers. Some said they had thought Giselle was shy or would wake up, or that they didn't know she was drugged. Several told investigators it wasn't rape if Giselle's husband had consented for her. He can do what he likes, it's his wife, one said. Others said in court that they now thought they had been drugged themselves. One said his body had somehow disconnected from his brain. About 20 other men were never identified and are presumed to be still at large. None of the men accused of rape, who turned up at the Pellicott home to find Giselle limp and not moving, contacted police. Not even when Dominique boasted to them, the men told the court that after drugging his wife, he would also take her to motorway laybys and hand her to men. Dominique later told the court that he did not hand his then-wife to men at roadsides, but had once drugged and raped her himself in a motorway layby on the way back from their daughter's holiday home. One electrician who denied raping Giselle said he had called Dominique sick when, after an alleged rape, he mentioned the motorway laybys at the couple's bedside. But the electrician said he hadn't wanted to waste my time at the police station, because he said he wouldn't have been believed. A 42-year-old lorry driver, who decided not to go to the Pellicott's home, but was called as a witness, told the court he worried about something bizarre taking place when he was contacted by Dominique on Coco, asking if he would do some gardening work for him. He would then pay him by offering you my wife, who would be asleep. The man did not accept the offer and stopped all contact. But he said he didn't call the police because it was difficult to report things you haven't seen, and I didn't want my wife to know I went on websites like that. One of the key questions that will remain long after the verdict is how Dominique had not been stopped before 2020, given he had previously come to the attention of police. In the summer of 2010, a decade before his arrest for upskirting in the Carpenter's supermarket, he was caught filming up women's dresses with a small camera, hidden in a pen in a supermarket in the Seine-et-Marne area east of Paris, near where he and Giselle lived. He was arrested and accepted a fine of €100 to avoid going to court. During the trial this year, he told the court that he wasn't good at secretly filming up skirts, only ever managing 3 or 4 pictures before getting stopped. I was never informed, Giselle said in court. If she had been told, she said, she would have taken notice and acted. She would not have lost 10 years of my life. After his arrest in 2010, Dominique's DNA was collected by police. When it was entered into a national database, it matched with a trace of blood found on a shoe at the scene of an attempted rape of a young estate agent outside Paris in 1999. At that time, Dominique was 46 and had previously worked as an estate agent himself. The attacker had walked into an estate agent's office in the Seine-et-Marne area and said he wanted to urgently view a top-floor rental flat, giving a false name and address. The young estate agent tasked with showing the man round was 19 and had just started working there. Once in the flat, she was pushed to the ground on her stomach, her hands tied behind her back with rope and her mouth and nose covered with fabric soaked in ether, which can have an anesthetic effect. It smelled very strong. It made my head turn, the woman later told investigators. I was a prisoner in my body and felt I couldn't move. Some of her clothes were removed by her attacker, who placed her shoes neatly beside her. She felt a knife held to her neck. She came round and fought back, managing to lock herself in a cupboard, and the man left. The 2010 DNA evidence that showed a match with Dominique did not make it into the case file at the time. It is unclear why. Possibly communications went astray. But the cold case was reopened by an investigating magistrate in Nanterre after his 2020 arrest for raping his wife. Questioned by police in 2022, Dominique first denied any involvement until he was presented with the DNA evidence. He then admitted attempted rape, but denied using a knife as a weapon. He told police he had had an urge the moment he saw the woman, but that when he took her trousers off he'd realized she was the same age as his daughter, and he had felt blocked. Giselle had no idea this had happened either. When I discovered that he'd attempted to rape a young woman the same age as his daughter, it was like an explosion, she said in court. Police also noticed that there were similarities between that incident and the 1991 rape and murder of another estate agent, aged 23, who had also just started out in her job. A man who gave a false name and address had asked to look at a top-floor flat in Paris. The estate agent, who had been strangled to death and knifed, was found on her stomach, hands tied behind her back, shoes carefully placed beside her, with a smell of ether in the room and traces of ether in her blood. Dominique has denied any involvement. He has been placed under formal investigation for both crimes, and the investigation continues. By November 2020, when the police told Giselle that they had found videos of her being raped, she had already become so concerned about her regular blackouts, moments of memory loss, brain fog, and terrible fatigue. She was sure she would soon be told she was incurably ill. She had feared Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, or a brain tumor, even if scans and tests kept coming back negative. None of the many neurologists and doctors she consulted suspected drugging or tested for it. She thought her husband was a love for insisting on coming with her to all her appointments and reassuring her she was fine. But weird things were happening. She sometimes slept 18 hours straight without waking up in the morning. Once she went to a hairdresser's appointment for a color, cut and blow dry, but had no recognition of it when later at home she looked in the mirror. She stopped driving alone, and went on a train to Paris to visit her children and grandchildren. She would pinch her thigh constantly, worried she would fall asleep and miss her stop. Once, she noticed that a new pair of her trousers had bleach marks on them, and she had no recollection of how. "You're not drugging me by any chance, are you?" she asked her husband as a joke. He burst into tears and asked how she could accuse him of such a thing, so she never made that type of joke again. Her husband told her she was just tired from looking after her grandchildren. Giselle went to gynecologists over discomfort and strange symptoms. Again, Dominique always accompanied her. I consulted 3 gynecologists. Several times I had woken up and felt as if I had lost my waters, as happens when you give birth, she told the court. Once her husband joked to her, "But what are you doing at night?" implying she was having affairs. She never suspected him, thinking him a wonderful guy. Sometimes in a conversation, she'd just switch off, her eldest son, David, told the court. Once her 2 young grandchildren had been surprised she wasn't up for breakfast, and had tried to shake her awake in her bed, and were shocked when she didn't move. At a family dinner, her youngest son, Florian, had noticed his father offer his mother a glass of rose. After she drank it, he says she became groggy, staring ahead, while Dominique rushed to put her to bed. Florian had also started noticing that his father was possessive over his computer and camera, and that he had been using pornography. Aurora, Florian's then wife, had walked in on him masturbating in front of the computer. One summer, while visiting his parents in Mazan, Florian was printing out coloring sheets from the cartoon Paw Patrol for his children, and came across an empty file on his father's computer called Martine's Knickers. Aurora, who told the court she was raped by her grandfather, who was a gendarme as a child, was concerned when she heard Dominique complaining to one of his grandchildren that they never liked playing doctors with him. An investigation continues into whether Dominique might have abused any of his grandchildren. He denies this. Throughout the trial, one question was raised again and again. Why had Dominique done it? Why had he started drugging his wife of 50 years, whom he called a saint? He told the court that Giselle had saved him from his awful childhood, during which he said he was raped aged 9 by a nurse in hospital, and as a 14-year-old apprentice on a building site said he had witnessed, and was forced to take part in, a group rape of a woman he described as disabled. His father, the court heard, was controlling and tyrannical, and was suspected of having groomed a young girl with disabilities whom he fostered and later made his partner. Had Dominique started to abuse his wife because it was easier than hunting other women? He told the court that he had a dark side, that from the age of 60 he found himself more demanding in terms of sex, and that there were things his wife wouldn't do, so he drugged her to do them to her while she was unconscious. He said he couldn't stop, and at one point was drugging and raping her 2 to 3 times a week. Giselle told the court she didn't feel herself going under when drugged and had no memory of the events. "I went to bed in my pajamas. I woke up in my pajamas," she said. One of her lawyers, Antoine Camus, suggested Dominique, by drugging his victim, was trying to commit the perfect crime. Dominique said that it was once the couple had retired and moved to Mazin in 2013 that he stepped up inviting men to rape his wife. He said he made it clear to them that she would be drugged unconscious. Most came from within a 40-mile radius of the village. One drove 2.5 hours from Lyon. Another was dropped off by car by his girlfriend, who waited for an hour in a car parked nearby. She thought he was meeting a couple for a sexual encounter, but said she didn't ask for details. A guard at the prison where Dominique was first held after his arrest in 2020 was also arrested and charged with having raped Giselle in her bedroom the previous year. The 29-year-old admitted rape, saying he'd realized in his car afterwards while driving home that something wasn't right. The overriding question, set out by Camus in his final statement to the court, was what was the common denominator between all these men? Was there something that might explain their behavior? Camus said there wasn't one. He said these were men who simply chose to rape. The court heard that many of the accused had been sexually abused as children, perhaps up to 40%, including one who was the victim of a notorious child abuser and murderer. Another was raped by his father as a very young child, and was placed in care where he continued to be abused. Dominique told his trial, "You're not born a pervert, you become one," suggesting that the rapes that he admitted to were linked to his own abuse as a child. But as one court psychiatrist, Laurent Layet, told the trial, it was very important to point out that scientifically there is no relationship of cause and effect. "It is not because you have been a victim that you become a perpetrator," he said. Some of the accused had childhoods of neglect and abuse so bad it amounted to what the same psychiatrist in one case called torture. One compared his father to Hitler. Another had said he was raised by pigs in the woods. Others described growing up happy with piano lessons and lacking for nothing. One said his province childhood was so idyllic it was like a book by the writer Marcel Pagnol. Some had criminal records for domestic violence, driving offenses or theft, others didn't. Some were married, some were single. Some had struggled at school, one had 2 degrees. Several were hooked on cannabis, others didn't smoke. 5 were accused at the time of their arrest of possessing child abuse imagery, which some denied, some admitted. Many used pornography, some paid for sex. "What truck driver hasn't been to prostitutes?" asked one international lorry driver, who denied raping Giselle. As the dozens of men from all walks of life filed into court during the trial, sometimes they were referred to in media coverage as Mr. Average or ordinary guys. But as Layet said in court, in medical and legal terms they could not be called ordinary men, because that would be saying that all men were capable of this. Nor could he say they were monsters, as most of them did not have the criminological profile of serial killers. Giselle has said there are lessons to be learned about the scale of rape and abuse in France. "The profile of a rapist is not someone met in a car park late at night," she told the court. "A rapist can also be in the family, among our friends." Aurora, the ex-wife of the Pellicot's youngest son, told the court, "We're asking the question today. How can we get into this situation? How can a human being do something like this? There is no one profile of a rapist. My grandfather who abused me was a gendarme. That's ironic, a man supposed to protect us, but who abused?" But she said the trial was indicative of modern society, where abuse has become a banality because abuse is everywhere. Despite this case, she said she still had faith in humanity. "I still believe in human beings." But she said society needs to look at how we got to this, about how the things that happened in this trial could take place in order to protect future generations. That is what's at stake. Story 3. The crime in room 406. Something terrible has happened over at Hotel Hollis. These were the words that greeted me when I reported for duty on the morning of May 31st, 1925, at Division 4 Station House on Lagrange Street, Boston, Massachusetts. The speaker was a youth I recognized as one of the bellboys at Hotel Roland, located nearby on Tremont Street and patronized by theatrical people. His face was ghastly, and he was trembling like a poplar leaf in the breeze. "What is it?" I questioned. It looks like murder," gasped the bellboy. I called a patrolman to accompany me and took the frightened youth back to the hotel. At the entrance encountered the room clerk and the manager, James Reagan. They too appeared white and shaken. After what I saw a few minutes later, I felt a little pale myself. In my years of police work, I have seen and investigated many strange and horrible crimes, but the Hotel Hollis mystery, as this case became known in the trying days that followed, stands out in my memory as one of the most brutal and difficult of my. A few quick questions, and I had learned enough to order the officer with me to hold everyone in the hotel. Then I went up to room 406. Clustered in the hallway around the door was a group of frightened employees and guests. I stepped into the bedroom. Face down on the bed was the body of a woman. Her arms were drawn behind her back and bound together with strips torn from the bed sheets. The disarranged bedding suggested a fearful straggle. Above her rent and dye, beveled nightdress, I saw on her neck dark discolorations and scratches. Blood from her mouth stained the pillow, into which her face was deeply pressed. I touched the body. It was cold. I knew then she had been dead several hours. Obviously, she had been murdered. My job was to find the murderer, but first there were certain routine things to be done. Nothing could be disturbed until the medical examiner had made his inspection. I telephoned a brief report to the station house and arranged for Inspector James A. Dennessy, head of the homicide squad at police headquarters, to be notified. I then telephoned the district medical examiner, Dr. Timothy Leary. Other officers were hastily sent over front the station house, and I placed them and ordered everyone in the hotel held. While awaiting the Med-KL examiner and Inspector Dennessy, who soon arrived with a police stenographer, I learned these facts. The dead woman was Mrs. May Pryor, wardrobe mistress of the Brown Derby Theatrical Company, which had closed its run at a Boston theater the previous evening. It was now Sunday morning. She had retired to her room alone around midnight, or shortly thereafter, planning to go to New York with other members of the troupe on the noon train Sunday. When she did not respond to repeated telephone calls to her room that morning, a bellboy had been sent up to awaken her. He found the door ajar and looked in. What he saw sent him racing back to the hotel desk with the alarm, and then over to the police station to get me. Cool, skillful, experienced Dr. Leary began his expert examination. His keen eyes seemed to take in everything at a glance. "She certainly put up a good fight," he told us. When he turned the body over, the face and chest showed that the woman had received a fearful beating. Some of the ribs were fractured. Wide bruises on the throat and the protruding tongue told that the unfortunate woman had been strangled. After a thorough examination of the marks on the throat, the medical examiner said, "Look for a person with extra large hands." That was the first real clue we had found. Then he made what seemed to be an important discovery. Under the dead woman's well-manicured fingernails was what appeared to be bits of human skin and dried blood. Laboratory examination later confirmed this. We now believed we had two clues of the greatest importance. The face or hands of the murderer would be marked by fresh scratches, and the murderer had unusually large hands. Mrs. Price's clothing, toilet articles, and other belongings were placed about the room in a natural manner, evidently as she herself had left them. On the floor near the bureau was a small envelope, the sort used as a pay envelope, one end torn off and dropped nearby. The envelope was empty. In a box we found a similar envelope containing a $5 bill and some change. The only signs of a struggle were confined to the bed, and we agreed that the murderer had surprised the victim while she was asleep, or there was another possibility. The bellboy who reported the crime that morning about 9:30 claimed that he had found the door of the room ajar. Was the murderer someone Mrs. Price knew and trusted? Someone that might be permitted to enter her room after she had retired for the night? Was the motive jealousy or revenge, or was it robbery? Or was there something behind this sordid crime we had not yet guessed? Under the bed, I saw a partly smoked cigarette. This might be a clue. Had the murderer been hiding under the bed while waiting for the moment to strike? Every person in the hotel was questioned before anyone was permitted to leave. Some of the guests protested against their detention, but it was necessary, and we didn't intend to take a chance that the murderer might slip out of the police net we had thrown about the entire establishment. Some of the members of the Brown Derby Company were at other hotels, and the manager of the show was registered at the Arlington Hotel. We rounded them all up. After our thorough questioning of everyone who might have any helpful information, we found no one who admitted seeing any person enter or leave room 406 between the time Mrs. Price retired and the discovery of the crime by the bellboy that morning. No one admitted having heard a sound of the frightful struggle we believed had occurred after midnight and before 2 a.m. The medical examiner assured us that Mrs. Price died about 2 a.m. The condition of the body and the mute evidence of the bed fairly shouted the story of the desperate battle for life the unfortunate woman had made. Yet none of the guests in adjoining rooms, none of the hotel staff, had heard a sound to arouse suspicion. We found something to strengthen the robbery theory. The show manager said the torn envelope had contained $80, Mrs. Price's pay given her the previous evening. Members of the company said Mrs. Price was the mother of the show and took charge of small sums of money for the younger girls. A Jewish boy in the cast had been befriended by her, I learned, and he had given her $60 to save for him. In all, it appeared, Mrs. Price had about $200 in her possession. But we had found in the room only the $5 bill and some small change. This young man who had given Mrs. Price $60 for safekeeping aroused my particular interest. He felt for her the affection of a son, he insisted. I also was interested in the information that the murdered woman's husband was a stage carpenter, employed in New York City. He was Bill Price, we learned, and worked in a theater at Broadway and 91st Street. This information was telephoned to the New York police, with the request that the husband be located and the news of his wife's death broken to him. We soon had word from New York that Bill Price had been working there Saturday evening until nearly midnight. News of his wife's terrible death was a great shock to him, and he was coming to Boston on the first train Monday morning to aid in the search for the murderer and to claim the body. I liked Bill Price on sight. He took his wife's death hard, and I felt mighty sorry for him. But I learned nothing that brought me any nearer the moment I was yearning for, the chance to slap the handcuffs on the murderer. Well, several days passed, and the police investigation seemed to be getting nowhere. Inspectors from headquarters, plainclothes men, an army of newspaper reporters, and plenty of others were looking for clues, and there were plenty of alleged clues turned in, but all proved worthless after a painstaking investigation. Anonymous letters came telling us to look up this person or that one. Several characters who hang around the South End were named to the police in this way as the wanted murderer. Not one of these possibilities was overlooked. Every lead we followed led us to the same thing, exactly nothing. One by one the inspectors were taken off the case for other jobs, but my superiors kept me plugging away. I was working night and day, going over the same ground again and again, racking my brains for the solution of a crime that at the start off had looked like an ordinary, routine case. Nothing seemed to break. It's just one of those cases that can't be solved, an inspector told me. I spent a lot of time around the hotel, talking with the guests who were still there and with the employees, searching for the lead I kept telling myself must be somewhere if I could only find it. Some of the folks who were there the night Mrs. Price was murdered might be, well, surprised to put it mildly, if they knew what a lot of miscellaneous information I casually picked up about them in the course of my intensive inquiry. On Tuesday, June 2nd, I recall, I heard that a theatrical man occupying room 606 with his wife gave a birthday party after the performance on the evening of May 30th, and was making merry with his friends at the very time that Mrs. Price was fighting for her life in the corresponding room, just 2 floors below. I found out who attended this birthday party and interviewed every one of them, on the off chance that something was seen or heard by somebody that would give me a clue. The man who gave the party told me about an odd thing that happened that night, but which apparently had no connection with the murder. He said that when he ushered his friends into his room after the theater, he left his door key on the corridor side of the lock. When the party broke up and he and his wife were preparing for bed, he couldn't find the key and decided it must have fallen out, and that someone had picked it up and turned it in at the hotel desk. So the door was secured with the inside bolt. Sunday morning he told the room clerk about it, but the key had not been turned in, and he was furnished with a duplicate. Miss May Jensen, a vaudeville actress who had a room on the top floor, was the only person I found who remembered seeing anyone acting in what might be a suspicious manner in the hotel the night of the murder. She told me that around midnight she was on the way to a friend's room to borrow a razor, and was accosted in the corridor by a large, rough-looking man. Miss Jensen said she supposed it was a would-be masher, a man who was aggressive in making advances towards women, but something about the man's manner so frightened her that she dodged back into her room and locked the door. Mrs. Price's room was down on the 4th floor, so Miss Jensen's adventure looked like a rather remote possibility as a clue. Saturday afternoon, June 6th, I decided to try something new. I believed I had exhausted every possibility in the hotel and among the guests and employees, and the crime was still unsolved. Room 406 and everything in it had been thoroughly examined for fingerprints without producing anything of value. I considered the possibility that one of the questionable characters frequenting the district might be able to give me a good tip. It was 1,000 to 1 shot, but the case had been getting more discouraging every day, and I was ready to try anything. If the motive for the crime was robbery, the murderer had made away with around 200. I wondered if I could find some tough egg around the district who had become suddenly affluent. Near the hotel, I saw a young fellow I knew. He was a bum actor who associated with underworld characters of the cheaper sort. "I want to see you," I told him. "Meet me on Dillaway Street in 10 minutes. Be sure to be there." I rather doubted the possibility of his showing up, but I knew it would be useless to try to get anything out of him. I saw the young fellow was getting nervous and trying to edge away. I guessed he was afraid someone would see him talking with me, and he didn't want the gang to think he was a stool there in the main street, where his questionable friends would see him talking to a police detective. So I acted as if I were merely passing the time of day with him, and kept my voice too low to be overheard by any bystander. In 10 minutes I walked through Dillaway Street, a quiet, side street, and found the young fellow in a doorway, waiting, where he was screened from observation. "I've always been on the level with you," I opened up. "Give me the office. Who bumped off that woman in Hotel Hollis? Look for that big gorilla that was hanging around the hotel last week," he blurted out, after hesitating a moment. "Who is he?" I asked the fellow. "Where does he hang out?" "Don't know anything about him." "How do you know this gorilla did it?" "I don't. You wanted the office, and I thought of this big gorilla, so I just told you about him. Who've you seen this big gorilla talking with?" I persisted. "Come on, you must have seen him speak to somebody." "Who?" "Well, the fellow told me. I remember one night last week I saw him stop to speak to a man I know. It was in front of the hotel. Benny Peretti was the man he spoke to. Benny was doing a tum at the theater here until Thursday, and now he is playing down in Newport, Rhode Island, and commuting back and forth to Boston. This tip looked pretty slim, but I was desperate and I couldn't afford to pass anything up. So I went to work to locate Benny Peretti. I learned he was staying at the new Tremont house, and usually got in around midnight. But before he left for Newport, I heard he might be found sitting around Boston Common. I failed to find him around town, so I went to the new Tremont house to wait for him. He came in late with his partner. I wanted a chance to talk with him alone, so I arranged for him to meet me at the police station Lagrange Street at 7:15 the following morning. The rest of the night I spent hunting around to find out something more about the man described to me as a big gorilla. Benny Peretti met me at the station house on time. In answer to my questions, he finally told me he knew the man I meant. He said the fellow tried to borrow some money from him sometime during the evening of Memorial Day. "I was with some fellows in front of Hotel Hollis," he told me. "I don't know the man's name. I only know him by sight." "Where did you meet him first?" I persisted. "How did you get acquainted with him?" "It was once when I was putting on a show for the prisoners at the federal penitentiary in Leavenworth," Benny Peretti told me. "They called him the Wop out there. That didn't sound just right, so I went after Benny pretty hard, and he finally told me he was a prisoner himself when he met this big gorilla he called the Wop. The story I finally got was this. Benny and his stage partner were young, fellows just getting started at the time they got into trouble. A trunk was delivered by the express company to their room by mistake, but they didn't say anything, and when the mistake was discovered they were arrested and prosecuted in the United States court because the trunk came from another state, and so it was an interstate affair. The two boys had no money for a lawyer, and were so frightened and inexperienced they pleaded guilty, thinking they would get out of it. However, they were both given terms at Leavenworth. Benny Peretti said the man he knew only as the Wop was in Leavenworth, and was such a bad actor he was kept locked up most of the time. Benny told me that one time the Wop escaped from Leavenworth by crawling through a sewer pipe, and was caught and brought back in a few days. He said he hadn't seen or heard anything of him until a week before, when the ex-convict accosted him and asked for money. Superintendent of Police Michael Crowley rushed a special delivery letter to Leavenworth for a picture and all available information about the prisoner, who had escaped through a sewer pipe at the time Benny told me the incident occurred. The answer came June 14th. In the meantime, I had been hustling on the investigation as hard as ever, but didn't turn up any other lead. The letter from Leavenworth said the man known as the Wop had served a long sentence for robbery under the name of Frank Corey. I took the Leavenworth picture to the Rogues Gallery at police headquarters and picked out half a dozen more pictures that were as similar as possible. This bunch of pictures I showed to Miss Jensen. I spread them out on the table and asked her if any of them was a picture of the man who accosted her the night Mrs. Price was murdered and frightened her so badly she ran into her room and locked the door. That's the man. I'm sure of it, the pretty vaudeville actress told me. She was pointing to the picture of Frank Corey from Leavenworth. Benny Peretti had left Boston in the meantime to play an engagement in New York. I took the pictures to New York and snowed them to Benny. He picked out the same picture Miss Jensen had. That's the Wop, Benny told me. I hadn't a thing to connect this federal ex-convict with the murder. I was just playing a hunch. I hadn't any idea where he lived or what had become of him either. Superintendent Crowley was backing me to the limit, and he expected me to make good. He sent another rush message to Leavenworth and asked for the names of anyone Frank Corey had written to while serving his sentence. We knew that such records are carefully kept at modern prisons. We were given 3 names and addresses in Yonkers, New York, in New York City, and in Worcester, Massachusetts. I went to Yonkers first and found the person the Wop had written to from Leavenworth was dead. Then I looked up the New York City address. It was on West 42nd Street, and I found it was a maternity hospital. No one in this institution knew anything about the man I was hunting for. I got a New York police detective to help me, and we started checking the number Leavenworth officials had given on every street on the west side from 32nd to 52nd. We hunted up the letter carriers too, but nobody had ever heard about any Frank Corey or the person whose name had been supplied by Leavenworth as that of someone the convict bad written to in New York. Then we tried the east side as a last resort. It was mighty hot and muggy in New York that week. I was nearly worn out by the long grind and lack of sleep. The detective with me finally quit to get some rest. I decided to try one more street and then knock off for a little while myself. A kid was eating a banana in a doorway. I started in there and slipped on the banana skin, fell and nearly broke my back. This was on East 42nd Street. I was sweltering and my hurt back was throbbing, but I forgot my discomfort a few minutes later when I bumped into a woman who said she recognized the picture of Corey as a man who had been living next door with a Polish blonde. The woman said the couple were there several years before and that they had cleaned out the landlady and escaped with the loot. The way I got the story, it appeared the Polish blonde was the woman Corey wrote to from Leavenworth, and he had joined her in New York after he was released. Well, the brakes were still against me, for the house next door had just been razed. I located the realtors and got the name of the trustee in a bank who had handled the sale for the landlady. I saw him and learned the landlady had just died. This looked like the end of the trail in New York. I couldn't find anything more there, and so I came back to Boston on June 21st and went to the station house to write my reports, feeling pretty discouraged. The superintendent had a talk with me. I told him there was still one more possibility, the address in Worcester. He told me to keep at it. He thought my hunch looked good. So I went to Worcester the next morning and called at the Worcester Police Headquarters to tell my story and get a detective to go with me. The address I had was Corey, 934 Grafton Street. On the way out there we met a motorcycle officer who told us the family at this address was named Krikorian and used the American name Corey. I showed him the Leavenworth picture and he said, "Sure, I know that fellow. That's Frank Corey. I was talking with him this morning. There's sewage draining into the road from the Corey place, and I told them it must be fixed." This gave us an idea. We arranged for the detective to take me into the house as an inspector from the health department, so I could talk with Frank Corey and get him down to Worcester Police Station for questioning without arousing his suspicion. There was a crippled girl in the house who said her brother Frank Corey had gone in town and would soon return on the trolley car. While the detective with me was talking about the sewage complaint, I saw a picture on a table of the same man I knew to be Frank Corey, ex-convict from Leavenworth. I slipped it into my pocket without anyone noticing, and then we left the house. It was arranged for the motorcycle officer to go up the road to wait for the trolley and see if Frank Corey was on it. I hid in the woods where I could watch without being seen, and the Worcester detective went to telephone. If Frank Corey was the man who killed Mrs. Price, I knew he would be on his guard, and I didn't want him to slip away from us. Presently, the motorcycle officer came back and said the man we were after was on the trolley and would soon be home. We started walking along the road, and just as we got to the Corey house, a big gorilla-like man turned into the yard. It was Frank Corey, the man I had been hunting for more than 2 weeks. We used the health department gag, and it worked. Frank Corey agreed to ride down to Worcester headquarters and get the sewage complaint fixed up. On the way he said, "Gee, you fellows hound a guy." When he was safely in the police station, I asked him, "When were you in Boston last?" "I was never in Boston in my life," answered. "Do you know the Hotel Hollis?" I asked him then. "Never heard of it," Corey declared. "I was never in Boston in my life." "You know the ropes," I told him. "You don't have to talk if you don't want to." "Do you know Benny Peretti?" "Over in Leavenworth Penitentiary," said Corey. I showed him his police picture and asked him, "Is this your picture?" "That's not my picture," the man denied. I told him he was under arrest charged with the murder of Mrs. May Price. Everything he had said and our questions had been written down, and I asked him to sign the statements he had made. Corey told me, "I'll talk, but I won't sign anything." He was locked in a cell, and I telephoned a report to Boston Police Headquarters. I was told that Captain Goodwin, my skipper at the Lagrange Street station, would come to Worcester in a police car and get the prisoner. In the meantime, Worcester police discovered they had a record of Corey. I learned he had been arrested a short time before on a charge of stealing a check and a bracelet. He agreed to make restitution to the plaintiff and was released. I found he had made restitution shortly after Mrs. Price was murdered. While Corey was locked up in Worcester after I had questioned him, he succeeded somehow in getting word out, and a lawyer came and told him not to talk. It was the same lawyer who represented him in the case where he had made restitution. The prisoner wouldn't say another word after that. He was as mum as an oyster when we took him to Boston for arraignment in court. The grand jury indicted him for murder in the first degree, and I worked up what I thought was a pretty convincing case for the trial. I recovered the bracelet he had stolen in Worcester, getting it from a man he had pledged it with for a loan. A Polish boy in Worcester told me that Corey had a big roll of bills when he came home early in June, and sent the boy to the store to buy a Boston newspaper. A clerk at Hotel Hollis identified Corey as a man who paid $1.50 in advance for room 512 on the night of May 28th. The clerk said he used the name Frank Muliono and registered again the evening of May 30th, but was not assigned a room because he attempted to pay for it with a check for $5 written with a pencil, and which the room clerk refused to accept. Miss Jensen identified the prisoner as the man who accosted and frightened her on the top floor of the hotel the night Mrs. Price was killed and robbed. The district attorney was satisfied with the theory of the crime we worked out, and it looked mighty good to me. I believed Corey had been lurking on the 6th floor of Hotel Hollis, where he accosted Miss Jensen, and that he took the key from the door of room 606 and used it to get into room 406, where he hid under the bed to wait for Mrs. Price. When we arrested him, he had a package of cigarettes of the same brand as the partly smoked cigarette I found under Mrs. Price's bed. My theory was that Corey started to light up while waiting under the bed, and realizing that the smoke might betray his presence when Mrs. Price came in, he hastily extinguished it after 1 or 2 puffs. I believed he was there under the bed when Mrs. Price entered the room, put her money on the bureau, undressed, and got into bed. Then when he supposed from her breathing the woman was asleep, he crawled out and was detected while securing the money. My evidence indicated that Corey grabbed Mrs. Price by the throat to prevent her from screaming, and was severely scratched on the hands and face during the desperate fight the unfortunate woman made to save her life. A man answering Corey's description, I eventually discovered, had visited a nearby drug store the day after the crime to get something for several severe scratches on his face. Worcester witnesses said Corey's face and hands showed some marks when he came home early in June. There was one mark on his face when we arrested him, almost healed, that he said was a cut from shaving. Corey's family spent about everything they had in his defense. He had a smart criminal lawyer, and there was a long drawn-out trial. The jury was out for hours and finally came in with a verdict of acquittal. I was amazed and bitterly disappointed, for I felt certain the man was guilty. So did the district attorney. We had learned that Corey had once deserted the United States Army. This gave me the chance for another effort. I arranged for the federal authorities to lock Corey up as a deserter while I did some more work on the case. A curious thing had happened during the trial. A conversation I overheard in the courthouse between 2 men indicated that Corey had gone to a room on Hanover Street after Mrs. Price was murdered. At the murder trial, we had not been able to show any of Corey's movements after the murder until he arrived in Worcester 2 days later. I succeeded in locating the room in the Crawford House Annex where Corey had gone shortly after the crime, following the clue from the conversation I had overheard at the courthouse. I found he had appeared there early in the morning of May 31st with money to pay $2.50 for a room. Corey wasn't satisfied with the $2.50 room, and after seeing it, he changed to another room for which he paid $3.50. I discovered he was wearing a raincoat when he came in and had left it there. I recovered the raincoat, and this coat was later identified by Miss Jensen and others as the one he was wearing at Hotel Hollis. For a long time the trail seemed to end at this Hanover Street room, but I wouldn't quit. Finally, I placed him the next night at Boston Tavern, the night of May 31st, 1925. The register confirmed the other evidence I secured, that Corey came there the night of May 31st with a woman companion and paid $6 for a room. The case now seemed ready for the next step we had been secretly planning. The evidence was presented to the grand jury, and a secret indictment was returned against Frank Krikorian, alias Corey, alias Costello, alias Muliono, charging him with robbery of Mrs. Price in Hotel Hollis. I went to Camp Devens, Massachusetts with the indictment warrant, and the federal authorities delivered the prisoner to me. There was a sensational trial. Frank Corey was defended by the same astute criminal lawyer, but this time the jury found him guilty of robbing the woman of whose murder he had been acquitted. The defense lawyer claimed Corey was being placed in double jeopardy and appealed to the higher courts, but was overruled. Judge Lowry sentenced Frank Corey to life imprisonment. He declared the crime was one of extreme atrocity, praised the jury for its intelligence, and intimated he was imposing the unusually severe sentence for robbery because of the unexpected outcome of the previous trial for murder. Story 4. The Sex Killer of Brooklyn, 1935. On the morning of April 1st, 1935, at 3:55 o'clock, Patrick Murray, a subway conductor on the Brooklyn-Manhattan transit lines, arrived home from his night's work. As soon as he entered the hallway of the two-story frame dwelling on Marine Avenue, Brooklyn, he noticed something unusual. The light in the hallway had not been extinguished. It is customary in most homes to leave a light burning at night when someone is still out. But Murray's landlady, 68-year-old Nora Kelly, who lived on the ground floor with her dog Brownie, had to count every penny. She had no source of income other than the $30 a month she received as rent from the Moyes, so she always turned out that hall light when she retired for the night. Murray, long a night worker accustomed to finding his way around in the dark, was surprised. The old woman would have a fit if she saw the light burning in the morning, he remarked to himself as he switched it off. Then he climbed the stairs to his own apartment, which he occupied with his wife, Helen, and their 4-year-old daughter, Eleanor. Murray was undressing for bed when he became conscious of a second unusual circumstance. Mrs. Kelly's dog, a crossbred collie, was howling mournfully in the backyard. This puzzled the conductor much more than the light. He knew it was the landlady's habit, every night, at 10 o'clock, to unleash Brownie from his kennel in the yard and take him into the cellar. Murray decided that Mrs. Kelly had gone visiting and failed to come home. That would explain both the light and the fact that the dog had not been taken in for the night. Surely if she were home, she would long since have heard Brownie's barking. I never knew her to neglect him like this before, he muttered. It's a strange thing indeed for a woman like Mrs. Kelly. Several more howls proved too much for him. He pulled on his trousers and a sweater, procured a pocket flashlight, and then tiptoed downstairs. The dog's cries thinned out to a whimper as he approached. Murray noticed that the 7-foot length of rope which leashed Brownie to the kennel had become frayed from his incessant leaping efforts to get loose. He was quivering and panting with impatience as Murray untied him. This, too, struck the man as unusual, for the dog showed neither relief nor gratitude, but only a desperate urgency, as though he were needed somewhere and must get there. He pulled Murray around to the front door, his claws digging frantically into the gravel walk. "Take it easy, Brownie," Murray whispered soothingly. "There's no great rush." But the dog strained at the rope, and his claws rasped on the stoop. He pulled Murray into the hallway and toward the cellar door. He threw himself at the door, whining. Murray, thinking only that Brownie had become cold out in the yard all night and was yearning for the warmth of the cellar, got the door open and, flashlight in hand, stumbled down the stairs. His intention was to tie Brownie up for the night there. Reaching the foot of the stairs, the dog immediately headed for the rear of the cellar, pulling Murray along. "Whoa there, old fellow," he said. "That's not where you sleep. Your place is." But Murray never finished what he started to say. The beam of his flashlight had picked out the black-clad figure of Mrs. Kelly hanging limply from a rafter 10 feet away. "My God," whispered Patrick Murray. The dog, released, whimpered and leaped at the motionless figure of his mistress. Murray drew nearer. He saw that the woman was hanging by a length of black insulated telephone wire. He remembered seeing this wire in the cellar recently. Nearby, a box lay on its side. Murray returned to the stairs. Brownie lay flat on his stomach under the body. He would keep vigil. Without awakening his wife, Murray went out of the house to an all-night lunch room on 4th Avenue. A few minutes later, a message to proceed at once to 360 Marine Avenue was picked up by Detectives Edward Swift and Fred Kuhn of the 64th Precinct, who were out on patrol. They found Murray waiting for them in front of the house, and he directed them to the basement. Immediately afterward, Detectives Joseph Billot and Dan Sullivan arrived from the precinct station house a half-mile from the scene. Brownie set up a terrific barking as the officers descended the stairs. Murray had great difficulty dragging him away from the body. "Has Mrs. Kelly been having any trouble lately?" one of the officers asked. "Not that I know of," Murray answered. "Of course she probably had difficulty making ends meet, but other than that, she seemed in good spirits. No reason that you know of for taking her own life, was there?" Murray said no, he didn't know of any reason. Her health hadn't been bad for a woman of her age, and she had seemed cheery enough in recent days. She got $30 a month rent, and her granddaughter, who worked as a maid and lived with her employers, probably contributed a little. Mrs. Kelly lived only for her granddaughter, whom she had reared since babyhood, Murray told them. Meanwhile, the detectives were scrutinizing the wire which had been tied around the beam and made into a noose. Murray identified it by the white porcelain insulator fixed in its center. He was positive he had seen this wire in the cellar on several visits. Flashlights moved about the basement. The officers noticed that the heavy furnace dust from the foot of the stairs to a spot under the body made it appear that the woman had been dragged through it. Either that, or Mrs. Kelly's skirt had brushed the dust as she came down to take her life. The flashlights uncovered something else. The woman's false teeth were lying on the floor about 12 feet from the body. Apparently the force of the plunge had knocked them out of her mouth. The detectives cut down the body, then proceeded upstairs. Meanwhile, the excitement had awakened Mrs. Murray, the daughter, and their police dog. There was no sound from Mrs. Kelly's apartment, so the Mays assumed that Mrs. Kelly's granddaughter, 18-year-old Florence McVeigh, had returned to her place of employment after spending her Sunday evening off with Mrs. Kelly. Florence worked for Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Armstrong, whose home on Fort Hamilton Parkway was within walking distance of the little house on Marine Avenue. 2 doors led out of the Kelly apartment into the hall. One from the dining room, which was the second room back from the sun porch, and one from the living room, which faced on the porch. The living room door was always locked because furniture blocked it on the inside, but the dining room door opened easily. The quartet of detectives stepped into the dining room and continued through into the kitchen, which faced the rear yard. They saw on the kitchen table a platter of meatballs and onions, part of a loaf of raisin bread, a half-finished glass of milk, and 2 coffee cups. Mrs. Kelly's purse, a much-worn, black leather bag, lay on the table, too. It was empty except for a few small house keys and a string of rosary beads. No money was found anywhere in the house in the search that followed. The officers could find no evidence of disorder in the kitchen, nor in the dining room. They went through to the front parlor. Detective Swift's light traveled across the papered walls, picked out the worn furniture, and then moved across the faded flowered carpet. Suddenly he cried out, "Look! Over by the sofa. It's another body." Florence McVeigh lay on the floor in front of a green cretonne-covered sofa. She was on her back, her head tilted to one side, eyes fixed on the ceiling. She was fully dressed except for her shoes, which were neatly placed under the sofa. The body was clad in a brown skirt, silk stockings, and a gray V-neck sweater. Her clothes were neatly arranged. An examination showed the body free from bruises or marks. It seemed as though she had died while sleeping on the floor. Hasty medical examination indicated that both deaths had occurred early the previous evening, between 8 and 9 o'clock. Mrs. Murray, who had been home all evening, said she had heard no sounds whatsoever, nor had her dog, a very alert animal, raised any alarm. There had been a party in the Murray home the previous afternoon in honor of Eleanor's 4th birthday, but the children had departed by 6 o'clock, and the house had quieted down sufficiently for Mrs. Murray to hear sounds from the Kelly apartment. She said the odor of frying meatballs permeated the house at about that time, which was Mrs. Kelly's usual supper hour. and she had heard Mrs. Kelly and her granddaughter talking together in the kitchen. Neither Mrs. Murray nor the neighbors had heard any unusual sounds. Mrs. Kelly's body was removed to the Fort Hamilton police station, and the girl's body was taken to the Kings County morgue. Except for the somewhat puzzling circumstance of the dust trail in the cellar, and the fact that there was no money in the house, the police were fairly satisfied that Florence McVeigh had died a natural death and that Mrs. Kelly had hanged herself. It was difficult to determine which of the two had died first. If the girl had died first, then it was possible that her devoted grandmother had killed herself in an overwhelming fit of grief. It was also possible that Mrs. Kelly, for some inexplicable reason, had taken her life, and that the girl had died of shock soon after discovering the body. This latter theory seemed unlikely, however, for if Miss McVeigh had sufficient strength to return to the first floor, after seeing her grandmother hanging by the neck in the cellar, then she must have had enough strength to scream the news to Mrs. Murray. Detectives checking on various angles learned that Florence had complained of feeling ill on Sunday afternoon. Her employer, Mrs. Armstrong, reported that the girl had prepared Sunday dinner as usual, and then complained that she had a sore throat and headache. Mrs. Armstrong suggested that she lie down. Florence did so, but soon was on her feet again, saying that she felt uncomfortable. The girl had left the Armstrong home at 2 p.m. and had apparently gone directly to her grandmother's. Florence had been working for Mrs. Armstrong for 6 weeks, doing housework and taking care of the 2 Armstrong children, Virginia, 6, and Maureen, 2. "I cannot understand this tragedy at all," said Mrs. Armstrong. "Florence did not seem seriously ill, and I know of no reason, unless it was grief over the girl's death, why Mrs. Kelly should have committed suicide. Florence was quiet, shy, and reserved. She remained in nights, had no beaux, and was devoted to her grandmother. She was a girl who read a lot. She had gone for 2 years to Bay Ridge High School, but quit school in order to help support Mrs. Kelly. So the case remained a natural death and a suicide for 8 hours. And then came a most sensational development. At noon, Dr. Emmanuel E. Martin, Deputy Medical Examiner, telephoned the office of District Attorney William F. X. Geoghegan and reported that Florence McVeigh had been criminally assaulted. In the first half of the century, criminally assaulted was code for sexually assaulted or rape. "She did not die a natural death," he stated positively. "I believe she was smothered to death." This piece of news threw the police into a state of feverish activity. As swarms of detectives poured back into the neighborhood of the crime, the body of Mrs. Kelly was rushed to the morgue, where Dr. George W. Ruger made an examination. Presently he reported that she, too, had been assaulted. Moreover, her chest had been crushed in, and she had been dead before the noose was placed around her neck. Investigators immediately recalled the recent mysterious murder of Victoria Muspratt, 70-year-old spinster and recluse, who on December 22, 1934, was beaten to death in her dingy home at Shore Road and 71st Street, only a mile and a half away from the Marine Avenue house. However, there proved to be a great deal of dissimilarity between the two cases. Miss Muspratt had long been suspected of being a miser with hidden riches, and robbery might well have been the motive. Mrs. Kelly, though a bank book in the house showed that she had $1,600 in a Bay Ridge bank, had been supporting herself and various children and grandchildren for 30 years. Also, Miss Muspratt had been known in the neighborhood as a crotchety old lady, while Mrs. Kelly, although keeping to herself for the most part, was liked and admired by the shopkeepers, neighbors, and the children of the community, in which she had lived for many years. Several of her children had been married in St. Patrick's Roman Catholic Church, where she attended Mass every Sunday. Investigating officials had little difficulty rounding up most of Mrs. Kelly's and Miss McVeigh's relatives for questioning during the afternoon. After visiting the scene, Vincent J. Ferrari, Assistant District Attorney, and Acting Captain Frank Seed Bowles, in charge of detectives for the 10th Inspection District, began their interrogations immediately. Miss McVeigh, they learned, had been cared for by her grandmother since she was 6 months old. The girl's father, William McVeigh, had disappeared many years before and had not been heard from since. Her mother had remarried and was now Mrs. Helen Steers of 471 40th Street. Neither Mrs. Steers nor her husband could give any information helpful to the investigation. They believed the murderer must have been a chance visitor, but the total absence of any disorder in the Kelly apartment led the police to reason that the victims must have known their assailant. Another daughter of Mrs. Kelly's, Mrs. Mary Johnson of 4606 6th Avenue, Brooklyn, collapsed as she was leaving the police station after questioning. she could shed no light on the crime. Nor could a sister of the slain landlady, Mrs. Bridget Marr, who lived at 411 100th Street, only 2 blocks beyond Marine Avenue. Mrs. Marr said she had not visited her sister much within the previous few years. However, questioning of various members of the family caused the investigators to concentrate their attention upon Edward Kelly, 45-year-old son of Nora Kelly. He visited the scene of the tragedy after he learned the news from Mrs. Marr, and readily answered a series of questions put to him regarding his movements during the previous evening. He admitted that he had seldom called on his mother, and had not seen her for a month. He said she did not like him to come around after he stopped bringing home money. Where did he live? He had no home, he said, because he'd had no job for some time. Occasionally he earned a little money doing salvage work on a nearby ash dump. Where had he spent the previous evening? He replied that he had slept in the basement of an apartment house at 8831 Fort Hamilton Parkway. His listeners exchanged startled glances at this piece of information, for the house in which he said he spent the night was next door to the Armstrong home in which Florence McVeigh had been employed. "Can you prove that you slept in that cellar?" Ferrari asked him. "Can you prove where you were during the early hours of the evening?" The ragged and unkempt Kelly replied that he could. He said he had been in the company of a crony named Jimmy White, that he had been with White all evening, and that White had also slept in the cellar. Detectives brought in White, who corroborated Kelly's story. They were both released, along with others who had been questioned. Solution of the mystery seemed difficult indeed at this stage of the investigation. The perpetrator of the double murder had left no clues at the scene. Very likely he had remained in the apartment long enough to wipe out any possible evidence he might have left. The police in this case appeared to have no such break as in the more recent Nancy Titterton murder, where the killer left a piece of upholsterer's twine which led to his undoing. It is a false theory that murderers invariably make one mistake which defeats them. After all, not every murder case is solved. But it is unquestionably a fact that, more often than not, there is a slip somewhere. Frequently the slip grows out of circumstances which the killer has not foreseen. In the Titterton case, for instance, we can believe that the police would have trapped John Fiorenza eventually, even if he hadn't left that bit of cord under the body of his victim, because he told his employer he visited the probation officer on the morning of the crime, and the police knew that the probation office was closed that day. Assistant District Attorney Ferrari and Captain Bowles were checking over their meager information at what might be described as the darkest hour of the investigation into the Kelly McVeigh murders, when a visitor was ushered into them. This person was Mrs. Eleanor Myers. She said she was a friend of Mrs. Kelly, and might have some information that would help to solve the mystery. "Let us hear it," said Ferrari. "Well, I went to call on Mrs. Kelly last night," said Mrs. Myers. "At what time, Mrs. Myers?" "It was just before 9 o'clock. Did you see her?" Mrs. Myers shook her head. "No, I didn't. I rang the bell, but there was no answer. I rang again. I was just about to go away, figuring she wasn't home, although I expected that she would be, when the door opened." Ferrari and Bowles stared at the visitor. "The door opened," repeated Ferrari. "Yes. It was her son-in-law who opened the door. Tom McFarland. I said I had come to call on Mrs. Kelly, and he said she wasn't home. You're positive it was her son-in-law?" "Oh, yes. He used to live with Mrs. Kelly, he and the 3 children. His wife died when the twins were born, and Mrs. Kelly raised all the children." "What happened after he said Mrs. Kelly wasn't home?" "Nothing. I just said I was sorry I had missed her, and went away. I didn't think anything more about it until I heard about what happened." Now the fact that a son-in-law named Thomas McFarland existed was not news to the police. They had planned to question him as soon as he returned home from work, just as they had questioned other relatives. Had he heard of the tragedy? If he had, then why hadn't he communicated with the police and told about his visit to his mother-in-law's? It was entirely possible that Mrs. Kelly was out at the time of Mrs. Myers' call, and that McFarland himself might have left the house before the crimes were committed. A native of Mobile, Alabama, Thomas McFarland had met Mrs. Kelly's daughter, Anna, while serving in the Army at Fort Hancock. They had been married that same year in St. Patrick's Church in Bay Ridge. The first child, Marion, had been born in 1921, and 3 years later the twins, Anna and Edith. Anna Kelly had died when the twins were born, and the family had gone to live with the grandmother. They had lived with her until November 1934, when McFarland rented a place on Humboldt Street. The police learned that he was employed as a varnish maker by the Paragon Paint and Varnish Company in Long Island City. Did McFarland hold the solution of the mystery? When he came to the door in answer to Mrs. Meyer's ring, were the two women already dead? And did his act in coming to the door constitute the slip which grew out of a circumstance he had not foreseen? Surely, if he were the killer, then he should never have answered the bell. McFarland was taken into custody at 5 p.m., 13 hours after the discovery of Mrs. Kelly's body, as he was leaving the Paragon plant. A good-looking man of 39, dressed in a gray suit, soft gray hat, and blue overcoat, he looked quite dapper. When he was taken into the presence of officials who included District Attorney Geoghegan and Deputy Chief Inspector John Ryan, it was difficult indeed to believe that he could be the man guilty of such a horrible crime. But there were blood spots on his suit, and there was fear in his eyes. After 5 hours of questioning, he began to weaken, and at 10:05 p.m., he broke down. With a stenographer recording every word, he told the following story. He had left his home at 236 Humboldt Street, Brooklyn, at 2 o'clock Sunday afternoon, after dining with his daughters. He had a glass of beer and some sherry during dinner, and on the way to the house on Marine Avenue, he stopped at a saloon, although he hadn't intended to do any more drinking. He consumed 5 more glasses of beer at the saloon, and also bought a bottle of sherry. Then he took the 4th Avenue BMT subway to 95th Street and walked the remaining few blocks to Mrs. Kelly's house. He insisted, time and again, that he went there with no malice in his heart against his mother-in-law, that it had been nothing more than a friendly visit. He arrived about dusk. The apartments on both floors of the house were illuminated. He was admitted by Mrs. Kelly, and saw that Florence was there, too. The latter, apparently still indisposed, was lying on the couch in the parlor. He accompanied Mrs. Kelly into the kitchen, where he opened the bottle of sherry and began drinking. He continued taking drinks from the bottle, and finally, about 8 o'clock, Mrs. Kelly told him to stop because he was making a pig of himself. Mrs. Kelly, who had refused to drink with him, said he would have to leave. According to his confession, she raised a chair as though to frighten me with it, and then everything went black before me, and I think I choked her. Florence, attracted by the commotion, came to the kitchen door and saw her grandmother unconscious on the floor. She exclaimed, "What have you done?" McFarland, frightened because she knew what had happened, seized her and choked her. According to his story, he was afraid she would grab a knife that was on the kitchen table. He did admit that he had done away with Miss McVeigh because she had been a witness. When she became insensible, he carried her back into the parlor. He insisted he did not remember assaulting either of his victims, but he could not deny it. According to him, he just couldn't remember because everything was blank. "But you remember answering the bell when Mrs. Myers called?" Geoghegan asked. "Yes. I shouldn't have gone to the door. That was a mistake." "It was indeed," the DA agreed. Young Marion McFarland tried to save her father at the trial the following January. The defense was that he had been shell-shocked in the war, and the child testified that he often was dizzy and excited over nothing, that on many occasions he had got out of bed and gone out in the middle of the night. When I would tell him about it the next day, he would say that he did not remember, she said. The defendant kept his head bowed and stared at the floor all the time his daughter was on the stand. When she was excused, she stepped down and walked to his side. "Daddy, please, Daddy, look at me." But he did not look up, and the girl was let out. The jurors wept, but not for Thomas McFarland. They found him guilty of murder in the first degree, and at 11:07 p.m., August 20th, 1936, he died in the electric chair at Sing Sing. Story 5. Psychosexual Killer Theodore Durrant, 1895. Theodore Durrant was born in Toronto, Canada, in 1871, and while a child came to San Francisco with his parents, who gave him a good education. In 1895, he was a medical student at Cooper Medical College. He pretended to be a devout Christian and was one of the most active members of Emmanuel Baptist Church, which is located on Bartlett, near 23rd Street. The younger members of this church organized a society for social purposes, and Durrant was elected secretary and was also a superintendent in the Sunday school. In 1890, for a most estimable young lady named Blanche Lamont, left her home in Dillon, Montana, because of poor health, and came to San Francisco to continue her studies for the purpose of eventually following the vocation of a school teacher. She made her home with her uncle and aunt, Mr. and Mrs. C. G. Noble, at 209 21st Street, where her sister, Maud, also resided. Blanche was a very religious girl and seldom went to places of amusement, but when she did, she was usually accompanied by her relatives. She always attended the Emmanuel Baptist Church and was a member of the Christian Endeavor, where she was a great favorite because of her lovable disposition and good qualities. On the morning of April 3rd, 1895, Miss Lamont left home as usual to attend the boys' high school, in which building she was taking a course at that time. While en route to this school, she was accompanied by Durant, who, after leaving her, went to the Cooper Medical College. After Miss Lamont finished her studies at this school, she repaired to the normal school on Powell Street, between Clay and Sacramento, where she was to take instructions in cooking, between 2 and 3 p.m. Shortly after 2 o'clock, Durant appeared in front of this school and waited impatiently until nearly 3 p.m., when Miss Lamont came out of the building accompanied by a classmate named Minnie Edwards. Durant approached and engaged Miss Lamont in conversation. Miss Edwards continued to the corner and got inside of the next southbound Powell Street car and saw Durant and Miss Lamont take seats on the dummy, Miss Lamont having her school books with her. Two other classmates of Miss Lamont, Miss Lanigan and Miss Pleasant, who were walking home, also saw her sitting on the dummy with Durant. On this day, some street pavers were relaying some old-fashioned paving at 22nd and Bartlett Streets, and as attorney Martin Quinlan was passing this place, curiosity prompted him to stop and watch the relaying of this almost obsolete style of paving. While so doing, Theodore Durant, whom he knew well, passed with a young lady of the same general appearance of Miss Lamont. They were then walking in the direction of the Emmanuel Baptist Church, a few hundred feet distant. Quinlan fixed the time as about 4:15 p.m. because of an appointment he was about to keep with a Mr. Clark on Mission Street. Diagonally across the street from this church, at 124 Bartlett Street, lived a Mrs. Leake, who had a married daughter named Mrs. McGuire, whose home was in San Mateo. On this date, the daughter came to San Francisco, called on her mother, and then went downtown to do some shopping, informing her mother that she would be back in the early afternoon. As it was growing late, the mother became uneasy about her daughter and sat in the window eagerly awaiting her return. At 17 minutes passed, for she looked at the clock and then returned to the window, but instead of seeing her daughter approach, she saw Durant, whom she knew well as a member of her church, and a young lady of Miss Lamont's general appearance walk up to the church, where Durant opened the side gate and followed the young lady inside. This was the last scene of Blanche Lamont. About 5 p.m., George King, the church organist, came to the church for the purpose of practicing for the next service. He had hardly begun his practice when Durant opened the door leading down from the belfry. Durant and King had been close friends, and King stated that when Durant opened this door he was very pale, nervous and weak, and was without a coat and hat. He stated that Durant explained his weakened condition by saying that he had been up near the roof, trying to locate a leak in the gas pipe, and had been overcome by gas. King ran to a drugstore near Valencia and 22nd Streets and returned with a bottle of bromo seltzer, which Durant drank. When he claimed that he had recovered, King asked him to assist in carrying a small organ from the auditorium upstairs down to the main floor. Durant consented, but King stated that he detected no odor of gas whatever while upstairs, and furthermore that all the gas fixtures had been inspected by plumbers just previous to this time and were in good condition. Shortly after removing the organ, the two men left the church, Durant walking to King's home with him, although Durant's home was in an opposite direction, and he claimed to be feeling weak because of his alleged narrow escape from gas asphyxiation. That night a prayer meeting was held at the church. Blanche Lamont, not having returned home, caused her aunt, Mrs. Noble, to worry greatly. Thinking Blanche might possibly have gone to the home of some friend, and would, as usual, attend the prayer meeting, Mrs. Noble also attended the meeting in hopes of seeing her niece. The lady was almost distracted, but refrained from telling of Blanche's disappearance, believing that the girl would return. Durant had a seat just in the rear of Mrs. Noble, and during the services said to her, "Is Blanche here tonight?" Mrs. Noble replied, "No, she did not come." Durant then said, "Well, I regret that she is not with us tonight, as I have a book called The Newcomes for her, but I will send it to the house." After a few days of suspense, Mrs. Noble could stand the strain no longer, and she communicated the mysterious disappearance of her niece to the police and the press. As Durant was above suspicion, no one considered it worthwhile to mention the fact that they had seen her in his company on the day of her disappearance. Durant called on Mrs. Noble and offered his services in the search for the lost girl, and subsequently intimated to Mrs. Noble and a fellow student named Herman Slagater that he had received information which caused him to arrive at the conclusion that Blanche Lamont had not departed from this life, but worse, she had departed from the life of morality, and was even then in a house of ill repute from which he would endeavor to persuade her to return to the path of righteousness. A few days after making this statement, The church janitor saw Durant at the Oakland Ferry Landing and asked him what he was doing there. Durant replied that he was working on a clue he had obtained as to Blanche Lamont's whereabouts. At the time of Miss Lamont's disappearance, she had 3 rings in her possession, and on April 13th the postman delivered to Mrs. Noble an examiner, wrapped in the usual fashion for the mail, and upon opening it, the 3 rings which Blanche Lamont wore fell out. Subsequently, Adolf Oppenheimer, who conducted a pawn shop at 405 DuPont Street, identified Durant as the man who attempted to sell one of these rings to him between the 4th and 10th of April. On April 12th, an estimable young lady named Minnie Williams left the home of C.H. Morgan in Alameda, and as she was about to leave his employ, she had her trunk sent to the residence of Mrs. Amelia Voy at 1707 Howard Street in this city. Miss Williams was also a member of the Emmanuel Baptist Church, and on this very day she announced to the Morgans that she contemplated attending a meeting of young church members to be held at the home of a dentist named Dr. T.A. Vogel at 7:30 that evening. The girl never appeared there, and Durant, who was secretary of the society and should have been prompt in attendance, did not arrive until 9:30 p.m., and his excited and overheated appearance was a matter of general comment among those present. The meeting adjourned at 11:25 p.m., and the young folks repaired to their homes with the exception of Durant, who, for reasons best known to himself, went to Emmanuel Baptist Church at this midnight hour. April 13th, the day Mrs. Noble received her niece's rings, was the Saturday preceding Easter Sunday, and the Christian ladies proceeded to this church laden with flowers to suitably decorate in honor of the greatest anniversary of the Christian year. Mrs. Nolt, of 910 21st Street, accompanied by Mrs. Minnie Lord and Katie Stevens, were among the first to arrive, and in the library they found the horribly mutilated remains of Minnie Williams. Her clothing was partially torn from her body, and she had been repeatedly stabbed, then gagged and outraged. Some of her torn clothing had been stuffed down her throat so tightly that it required considerable effort to remove it. A broken knife blade was still in her breast. The police immediately instituted an investigation, and Captain Lees, who was at the time in Los Angeles, proceeded to San Francisco to take charge of the case, assisted by detectives John Seymour, Ed Gibson, and others. Charles Hill, of 203.5 Bartlett Street, stated that about 8 o'clock on the preceding night he had observed a young lady of Miss Williams' appearance enter the church in company with a young man whom he thought was Theodore Durant. This caused a search to be made for Durant at his home, but it was learned that early on the morning of the discovery of Minnie Williams' body, he had left the city with the Signal Corps of the state militia. A search was made of his clothing in his room, and Minnie Williams' purse was found in his overcoat. Detective A. Anthony was detailed to trail Durant and arrest him, and on Sunday, April 14th, Anthony and Constable Palmer arrested him near Walnut Creek, notwithstanding the indignant protest made by Lieutenant Perkins against this outrageous accusation. While Anthony was engaged in apprehending Durant, the remainder of the detective force began a systematic search of the church, with the result that they found even a more blood-curdling sight in the belfry than that beheld by the ladies in the library. This belfry was in semi-darkness, but enough light entered for the detectives to behold what appeared like a marble carving of an absolutely nude girl lying on the floor, with a block of wood under her head. She was laid out on her back after death with her hands carefully crossed over her breast, in a position similar to that of bodies used by medical students in the dissecting room. A far more thorough search was necessary to locate her clothes and school books, but they were eventually found poked in between the studs and the lath and plaster of the building. Blanche Lamont's name appeared in the books. An autopsy disclosed the fact that she died from strangulation, but decomposition had reached such a state that it was impossible to determine if an outrage had been committed. While the body was as white as marble as it lay in the cool belfry, when it was removed to the body of the church, where the air was much warmer, it turned almost jet black. Notwithstanding the overwhelming amount of evidence, which proved conclusively that Durant accompanied Miss Lamont from the school to Emmanuel Baptist Church, he denied having seen her that day, and attempted to prove an alibi by swearing that he was at Cooper Medical College at the time it was alleged he was in the very act of murdering this girl. While it is true that the records showed that someone answered his name at roll call at the conclusion of Dr. Cheney's lecture, it was shown that it was customary for the students to answer for each other in case of absence, and no one would swear that Durant was present at this lecture. As proof that he was not present, it was shown that several days afterward he persuaded a fellow student, Mr. Glazer, to give him the notes that he, Glazer, had taken at the lecture. As soon as the finger of suspicion was pointed toward Durant, information poured into Captain Lees, proving that the prisoner was a degenerate of the most depraved class. For obvious reasons, names cannot be given of young ladies to whom he made the most disgusting propositions, and the wonder of it is that he was not killed, or at least exposed before. But in most instances the nature of his insults were such that the young ladies offended feared to inform their relatives, lest they would take the law in their own hands. One young lady told her mother that sometime previous to these murders, Durant had inveigled her into this same library, and excusing himself for a moment, returned stark naked, and she ran screaming from the church. Although Minnie Williams was frightfully butchered, and the room resembled a slaughterhouse, not one drop of blood could be found on Durant's clothes, and there is no doubt but that he was naked when he committed this crime. He probably strangled Blanche Lamont in the library, and then dragged her body up to the belfry head first. That this was the manner in which he got her body to the place where it was found was proven by the finding of hairs from her head which caught in splinters on the steps. Durant also attempted to inveigle Miss Lucille Turner into this library for the purpose of making a physical examination. The preliminary examination of Durant began before police Judge Charles Conlon on April 22, 1895. He was defended by General John Dickinson and later by Eugene Dupree. On May 22nd, he was held to answer before the Superior Court for both murders. Captain Lees and District Attorney William Barnes decided to try him for the murder of Blanche Lamont, as that appeared at the time to be the strongest case, but subsequently additional evidence was gathered which made the Minnie Williams case even stronger than the one on which he was tried. His trial began before Judge Murphy on July 22, 1895, and over 1 month was occupied in selecting a jury, during which time over 1,000 prospective jurors appeared in court. During the trial, the Alcazar Theater Company produced a play called The Criminal of the Century, which was a dramatization of the Durant murders. This was produced in defiance of an order of court prohibiting its production, and as a result W.R. Daly, the manager, was sent to jail for 3 days for contempt of court. During Durant's trial, 50 witnesses testified for the prosecution alone. On September 24th, the case was finally submitted to the jury, and after deliberating 5 minutes, brought in a verdict of guilty with the death penalty attached. The case was appealed to the Supreme Court, which affirmed the decision of the lower court on April 3, 1897. The day of execution was then set for June 11, 1897. At this stage of the proceedings, Governor James Budd was appealed to, and after making an extensive personal investigation, he concluded that Durant was guilty and refused to interfere. On April 10, 1897, he was taken to San Quentin, and another appeal taken which was denied. On January 7, 1898, he was hanged. He protested his innocence to the last, and was one of the coolest murderers who ever mounted the scaffold. When Warden Hale started to read the death warrant to him, he said, "I will waive that right and spare you an unpleasant duty." The parents took charge of the body immediately after the execution, and as they feared grave robbers, they attempted to have the body cremated, but no crematory in San Francisco would accept the corpse. So strong was the public sentiment. A Los Angeles firm accepted it, however, and it was cremated in that city on January 13, 1898. In nearly all cases when a celebrated criminal is captured, a certain class of women take advantage of the opportunity to leap into the limelight by showering him with attentions, and the more atrocious and depraved the criminal, the more these women appear in evidence. This case was no exception to the rule, and as soon as the trial began, a young woman of prepossessing appearance became a constant attendant, and almost daily presented Durant with testimonials of her sympathy in the shape of small bunches of sweet peas, which accounted for her being known as the Sweet Pea Girl. Durant did not know the girl, but with characteristic mendacity, he claimed that she was a friend who had positive knowledge of his innocence, but he was too chivalrous to divulge her identity. It subsequently transpired that she was Mrs. Rosalind Bowers, and was even then neglecting her young husband to worship at the shrine of this degenerate. She afterwards lived in a Sutter Street house under the name of Grace King, and was accused of inveigling a wealthy clubman named Edward Clark into a marriage while he was under the influence of liquor. The author has a photograph taken of Durant at a picnic when he was only 16 years of age, and the position in which he posed proves conclusively that he was a degenerate even as a child. Shortly before these crimes were committed, Durant's sister Maud went to Europe to study music. 14 years later, it was learned that Maud Allen, who was creating a sensation in Europe with the vision of Salome dance, was in reality Maud Durrant.